Killian Ashton opened his eyes and didn't scream. He wanted to. His throat tightened so much that the air got stuck somewhere between his ribs. The ceiling was white. Not the gray, mold-stained ceiling of a cell. White, with moldings shaped like grapevines. His bedroom. His old bedroom at the Ashton estate. He was lying on a soft feather bed and could feel his sweat-soaked silk shirt clinging to his body. Outside the window, the morning bells of Valenrit were ringing. He hadn't heard those bells in a year. The last time he'd heard a different sound, a brief whistle of metal, then nothing. Killian slowly raised his hand and touched his own neck. It was intact. His skin was smooth. No axe. No chopping block. No drizzling rain. His fingers were trembling so badly that he pressed his palm against his throat with both hands and squeezed, just to make sure his neck was still there, that his head was still attached. His stomach turned. He rolled onto his side and vomited right onto the hardwood floor. Sour wine. Yesterday's wine. He remembered that taste. He remembered that specific evening. 3 bottles of Southern Red from his father's cellar. He'd been drinking alone in his study and yelling at the valet for walking too loudly. That was it. That had already happened. A year ago. No. This is now. Killian sat up in bed. His head was splitting. The room swam before his eyes. On the table by the window lay an envelope with a black seal. He knew what was inside that envelope. An invitation to a hunt from Duke Valtor Myers. That very hunt. 3 days in the forests north of the capital. Lots of wine, lots of laughter, and one conversation by the fireplace. When his father signed the promissory note for the delivery of iron from the southern mines, a promissory note with a penalty clause amounting to 3 years' worth of the Ashton house's annual income, his father wouldn't read the fine print. His father would be drunk. Killian had been drunk last time, too. He didn't even know about this promissory note until Judge Dorn read it aloud in the courtroom. Killian stood up. His legs wouldn't hold him. He grabbed the headboard and stood there like that for a whole minute, breathing, just breathing. Then he looked at his hands, slender, white. His fingers were long and soft. The hands of a man who, in 19 years, had never lifted anything heavier than a silver cup. On his right pinky finger was a ring bearing the Ashton coat of arms, a hawk with outstretched wings. That ring had been removed from his finger before the execution. A guard had turned it over in his hands and shoved it into his pocket. At the time, Killian had thought that was the last thing they'd taken from him. Now the ring was back in place, warm from his body. He ran his thumb over the engraving and felt something inside snap. It didn't hurt. It was as if a string that had held everything together for a year had snapped. He began to cry, standing by the bed in his wet shirt, silently. The tears flowed on their own. He didn't wipe them away. He just stood there, looking at the ring and crying. Then he stopped. He wiped his face with his sleeve. He looked at the envelope with the black seal. He looked at the 3 bottles of wine sitting on the mantelpiece. He walked over to the first bottle. He pulled out the cork. The smell hit his nose, and his stomach twisted again. His body remembered. His body remembered the last night before the execution, when he'd been finishing off the prison swill and thought it would all be over by morning. He turned the bottle upside down over the chamber pot. Red wine poured out in a thin stream. The second bottle. The third. The room reeked of sour grapes. The door creaked. Bertrand stood in the doorway. The old butler, gray-haired, stooped, eyes like a beaten dog's. In a past life, Bertrand had been hanged in the estate's courtyard on the very same day the soldiers came for the Ashtons. He had tried to stop the soldiers. They hanged him on the gate. Killian remembered how Bertrand's body had swayed on the rope as they led him across the courtyard to the wagon. Now, Bertrand was standing there, alive. He blinked. He looked at the young master who, at 6 in the morning, was pouring wine into a pot. Bertrand opened his mouth. Closed it. He opened it again. He asked if a doctor was needed. Killian looked at him for a long time. Then he said, no doctor was needed. What was needed was a basin of cold water and a clean shirt. Not a silk one, a linen one. Bertrand blinked again. In 19 years, the young master had never once asked for a linen shirt. Killian added that he also needed breakfast, downstairs, with his father. Bertrand froze in place. Killian hadn't had breakfast with his father since he turned 14. The valet left. Killian heard Bertrand stand still for a few seconds behind the door. Then he hurried down the hallway, probably to the other servants, to tell them. Let him tell them. Killian walked over to the window and opened the shutters. Spring in Valenrit, the sun, tile roofs, smoke from the chimneys. Somewhere in the distance, a merchant was shouting. The city was alive, real. A year ago, this city had watched as his family was led to their execution. People stood along the streets. Some spat, some looked away. No one stood up for them. Killian turned away from the window. He picked up the envelope with the mirror's black seal from the floor. He turned it over in his hands. Then he carefully placed it back on the table, without opening it. He knew what was inside. He knew why. And he knew that neither he nor his father would go on this hunt. 363 days. His father is alive. Leah is alive. Meyer is still working in the kitchen. Bertrand still walks these hallways. The old dog still sleeps in the courtyard by the gate. Everything is in its place. Everything can be saved. But only if he stopped being who he was. Killian looked into the mirror on the wall. A young man with red eyes and a pale face was staring back at him. Thin, unhealthy, with dark circles under his eyes from constant drinking. Pitiful. He remembered how, in prison, one of his cellmates, the former treasurer of House Revan, had said that true power in Valenrit belonged not to those who wielded swords, but to those who had craftsmen. A single good blacksmith is worth more than a regiment of soldiers. A single healer can buy the favor of the crown for 20 years to come. Killian had listened back then, but didn't understand why he needed to know this. Now he understood. House Ashton is on the brink. Money is scarce. There are no allies. The army is weak. Its reputation lies in ruins. But there is something that none of the great houses possess. Killian knows which of the current generation will become the best on the entire continent in 10 years' time. He knows them by name. He knows where they are now. A kitchen maid with burned hands, a young apprentice boy who gets beaten for ruining metal, an old herbalist with a stall on the outskirts. They're nobodies now. In 10 years, each of them will change Aurelian, if they survive, if someone helps them survive. The water in the basin was ice cold. Killian submerged his and held it there until his lungs burned. He surfaced. He dried himself off. He put on the linen shirt Bertrand had brought him. The fabric was coarse, unfamiliar. Good. He went downstairs to the dining room. His father was already seated at the table. Lord Ansel Ashton, 52 years old, gray temples, heavy bags under his eyes. His doublet was buttoned crookedly. He held a goblet in his hand. It wasn't tea in the goblet. Killian knew his father had started drinking after his mother's death 3 years ago. At first, only in the evenings. Then, starting at lunch. For the past year, starting in the morning. Lord Ansel looked up at his son and froze for a second. Killian was sober. At 6 in the morning, wearing a linen shirt. At breakfast. His father didn't say a word. He just stared. Killian sat down across from him. He looked at the table. Bread, butter, cold cuts. He picked up a piece of bread. He began to eat. Then he said good morning. His father's hand twitched. The cup clinked against the table. He muttered something in reply. They ate in silence. Killian didn't try to say anything else. No need to rush. No need to scare him. Just sit beside him. Just eat bread. Just be here. The door creaked on the left. Leah, his younger sister, 14 years old, dark hair braided into a plait, a simple dress. She stopped in the doorway and looked at her brother, then at their father, then back at her brother. Killian caught her gaze, wary, cold. In that gaze lay 3 years of silence, 3 years of closed doors. He remembered how they had shaved her head at the debtor's monastery. He remembered how they wouldn't give her any books. He remembered how she died 2 years later from a fever because the monastery had skimped on doctors. It became hard for him to breathe. He nodded at her, just a nod. Leah raised an eyebrow. She sat down at the table. She took some bread. The 3 of them sat at the table and ate in silence, for the first time in 3 years. Bertrand stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the scene. Killian noticed that the old man's eyes were shining. Breakfast was over. His father left. Leah left. Killian remained alone at the table. He finished his tea, then he stood up and went to his room. He sat down at the desk. He found a blank sheet of paper and a pen. He began to write. Not a letter, a list. Names, dates, events. Everything he remembered from his year in prison. Everything the former nobles had told him in their cells. The Myers schemes. The names of corrupt judges. The routes of the frontmen. He wrote for 2 hours. His hand ached. His handwriting was terrible because, in his past life, he had barely known how to write anything longer than a note to a maid. But he wrote it all down. 12 pages. He rolled it up. He hid it in a desk drawer beneath a false bottom. He'd discovered that false bottom by accident when he was 13. No one else knew about it. Then he stood up. He looked out the window. Servants were walking around the courtyard. Someone was carrying water. Someone was sweeping. A typical day, a typical morning, for everyone except him. He turned toward the door. He took a deep breath and went downstairs to the kitchen, a place the heirs of the House of Ashton never went. The House of Ashton's kitchen occupied the entire basement. Low ceilings, stone walls covered in soot. 2 large fireplaces were burning at the same time, and the heat was so intense that Killian instantly broke out in a sweat. He stopped on the bottom step. 4 women froze. Matilda, the head cook, a large woman with a red face and hands like a blacksmith's. Next to her were 2 assistants. Killian didn't remember their names, neither in his past life nor in this one. And by the far wall, with her back to him, stood a skinny girl of about 15. She was scraping a copper pot and hadn't heard him come in. Meyer Hale. Matilda curtsied and asked how she could be of service. Her voice was cautious, like that of someone waiting for a blow. Killian remembered that in his past life, he had once come down to the kitchen drunk and smashed a pot of soup because the soup seemed cold to him. After that, Matilda walked around with a bruise on her cheek for a week. Not from him, from the manager, who decided that the cook was to blame for the young master coming into the kitchen. He said he wanted tea. Matilda blinked. Tea. The young master had come into the kitchen, all by himself, at 6 a.m, for tea. She started fussing about. Killian said he wasn't in a hurry, and that he didn't just want tea, he wanted tea with mint, if they had any. Matilda nodded. She turned toward the shelves. Killian seized the moment and walked over to the wall where clay pots of oils and spices stood. He knew that Lady Rowena's stepmother had ordered rose oil from a merchant in the capital 6 months ago. Expensive. For baths. She'd used it once and forgotten about it. The jar was on the top shelf. Killian found it by its scent. He took it off the shelf. He turned around. Meyer was standing by the cauldron, staring at him. Her eyes were wide, frightened. She was clutching a rag with both hands. Her hands were red. The skin on her wrists was cracked from the lye. There was a fresh burn on her right wrist. Killian walked toward her. Mire took a step back. He stopped. He set the jar of oil on the edge of the table in front of her. He said it was for her wrists. Rub it on twice a day, morning and evening. Mire looked at the jar, then at him. She didn't move. He added something else. He said that regarding the lemons she peels for her father, don't throw away the peels. Dry them on the windowsill of the north-facing window. There's a good draft there. In a month, he'll explain why. Mire opened her mouth. She closed it. She didn't say anything. Killian nodded at her. He took the tea from Matilda. He thanked her, and he left. On the stairs, he heard silence behind him. Absolute silence. 4 women stood in the kitchen, silent. Then Matilda's voice, quiet, confused. She said the young gentleman seemed to have hit his head, but it was better that way. Killian went up to his room, sat down at the table with his tea. His hands were still shaking. Not from a hangover. The hangover was already wearing off. They were trembling because of what he had seen. Meyer, 15 years old, scorched wrists, a haunted gaze. In 6 years, this girl would create perfumes that queens of 3 nations would buy. Her creations would be worth a fortune. Every perfumer from Valenrit to the southern shores would know her name. But that would only happen because a single merchant happened to spot her at the market. In 3 years. 3 years of torment in the kitchen. 3 years of burns, lie, and silence. Killian couldn't wait 3 years. He didn't have 3 years. He had 1 year. He took a sip of tea. He looked at the envelope bearing the Mir's seal. The hunt was in 5 days. His father would be going. His father always went to the Mirs. He considered Duke Valtor a friend. He was wrong. Killian had to make sure his father didn't go. But he couldn't just say, "Don't go." His father wouldn't listen. His father considered his son a drunken fool, and he had every right to, so he needed another way. Killian thought, for a long time. Then he stood up and went to his father's study. Lord Ansel was sitting at his desk. Papers lay before him. A goblet stood nearby. His eyes were cloudy. He looked up at his son, and something flashed across his face. Not irritation, but surprise. Killian sat down on a chair by the wall, not at the desk, not across from his father, but on a chair by the wall, like a supplicant. Lord Ansel frowned. Killian said he wanted to talk about the Myers. His father set down the goblet, slowly. He asked what exactly it was about the Myers. Killian replied that he'd received an invitation to a hunt, and that there was something he didn't like. His father smirked. He asked what exactly it was that he didn't like. He used to like everything, especially the Myers wine. Killian let that pass. He said he'd heard it from one of the merchants at the market, that the Myers were buying up the IOUs of small houses, 3 houses in the last month. It was true. Killian knew this from conversations in prison. The former treasurer of House Raven used to tell stories at night about how the Myers were destroying the small houses, always following the same pattern. First, the hunt, then the contract, then the debt, then the accusation. His father was silent. He looked at his son. His eyes grew a little clearer. He asked which merchant it was. Killian gave a name he'd made up on the spot. Who Bernard from the Eastern Market. His father could have checked, and he wouldn't have found any Bernard. But the seed had been sown. That was enough. His father fell into thought. Killian stood up and left. He didn't press the issue. He didn't try to persuade him. He simply planted the thought. In his past life, he had never spoken to his father about business. Not once. Even when they were being led to their execution, they walked side by side in silence because they had nothing to say to each other. Now he had something to say. But he had to speak slowly, 1 word a day. Otherwise, his father would decide he was possessed, and the Church of the Seals burns people for possession. Killian spent the rest of the day in his room. He reread his notes. He added details that surfaced in his memory. Judge Dorn, City Guard Captain Olson, Notary Freed. In 10 months, they'd all be sitting in the courtroom watching Lord Ansel's sentence being read. Killian wrote down every name. Next to each name, he noted what he knew about that person. Dorn takes bribes through his wife. Olson owes the Gersums for covering up a murder. Fried is just a coward. Each one can be stopped. Each one can be taken aside. But that takes time, and no one must notice that Killian knows what he shouldn't know. That evening, the house manager, Master Claude, stopped by. A gaunt old man with a sharp nose and a habit of recording every expense down to the last copper coin. He brought the monthly bills. Usually, Killian would toss them aside without looking. Today, he picked them up, opened them, began to read. Master Claude watched him as if he'd just seen a dog stand on its hind legs and start talking. Killian read the bills and realized the scale of the disaster. The Ashton house was spending 3 times more than it earned. The upkeep of the estate, the servants' wages, his stepmother's dresses, his own debts at the gambling houses, wine. A single bottle of wine cost more than a year's income from the southern field. He closed the folder. He looked at the steward. He asked which expenses could be cut first. Master Claude was silent for 17 seconds. Killian counted. Then the old man spoke, carefully, slowly, as if explaining something to a child. But he spoke, and Killian listened, for the first time in his life. That night, Killian lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Behind the wall was Leah's room. He could hear her walking, light footsteps, then silence. She'd gone to bed. In his past life, he'd never once stopped to think about the fact that he heard her footsteps every night. Not once. He rolled onto his side, closed his eyes, and felt it. Something. Not a sound, not a touch, a sensation, as if someone very old and very tired were staring at the back of his head. He didn't turn around. He just lay there and felt that gaze. Save at least 7. He didn't remember when he'd heard those words. Didn't remember who'd said them. But they were inside him like a nail driven into bone. 7. He had to save 7 people. He didn't know what would happen if he succeeded. He didn't know what would happen if he didn't. But he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep tonight. He lay there until dawn. He counted the days. 362. Yesterday was the 1st. Today was the 2nd. 361 left. Killian gave Mira rose oil and a clue involving lemon peels. He planted the first seeds of doubt in his father's mind regarding the Myers by mentioning the buyout of the promissory notes. He studied the house's finances and realized the scale of the debts. That night, he sensed the presence of a force that brought him back, and he remembered the terms of the deal. Save at least 7. On the third day, a reply came from the Myers. Not a letter, a man. Cassius Myers, the Duke's nephew. 24 years old, tall, blonde hair slicked back, dressed as if he were going to an audience with the king rather than a morning visit to a neighboring house. His smile was such that one you couldn't help but smile back. Killian remembered that smile. It was with that very smile that Cassius had stood in the courtroom when the charges were read. It was with that very smile that he had approached Killian after the verdict and quietly said it was a pity, that he had warned him, that he shouldn't have gotten involved with people stronger than himself. Killian hadn't understood then. Now he did. He just didn't feel sorry. Cassius was relishing it. The butler, Bertrand, showed the guest into the small parlor. Killian came downstairs 10 minutes later, on purpose. He remembered that Cassius hated waiting. Cassius was standing by the window. He turned around, smiled, said he was glad to see an old friend, that he'd been worried, that he'd heard Killian hadn't been to the casino for 3 days. That was a record. Killian sat down in an armchair. He didn't smile. He looked Cassius in the eyes, calmly, for a long time, and he saw something. Cassius didn't blink. He didn't look away, but his pupils dilated slightly, for a second, then they returned to normal. Killian knew that moment. It was the moment when one player realizes that the other can see the cards too. Cassius asked if he was feeling all right. His voice was even, warm, caring. Killian replied that he was doing great, that he'd decided to change his habits a little. Less wine, more morning walks. Cassius nodded. He said that was wonderful, and that his uncle was expecting him and Lord Ansel on a hunting trip in 2 days, that it would be boring without young Ashton. Killian thanked him for the invitation. He said that, unfortunately, he wouldn't be able to make it. House affairs. Cassius raised an eyebrow. House matters. Killian Ashton's. He didn't say it out loud, but his smile grew a little wider, a little sharper. He said that was a great pity, and that he hoped Lord Ansel would come after all, without his son. Killian replied that his father was busy too. A pause, a brief one. Cassius tilted his head. His eyes grew a shade colder. He said he understood and that his uncle would be disappointed. He stood up, walked over to Killian, placed a hand on his shoulder, said he was glad to see the changes, that he liked the new Killian. The palm was warm. His fingers squeezed the shoulder slightly. It didn't hurt, but it was noticeable, like a mark. He left. Killian sat in his chair and listened to Cassius's horse's hooves clattering on the cobblestones outside the window. He knew. He knew for sure. Cassius had sensed something. Maybe he didn't understand it yet. Maybe he'd dismissed it as a coincidence. But he'd noticed that Killian Ashton wasn't the same anymore, and now he'd be watching. He should have acted faster. Killian left the house in the afternoon. It was the first time in the last 6 months that he'd been sober in the city in broad daylight. Valenrit was a large city, 120,000 residents, 5 ring walls, a central quarter for the nobility, shopping arcades, artisan streets, each street dedicated to its own craft, Copper Street for blacksmiths, Tea-Silk Alley for weavers. He walked down Copper Street, searching. The third workshop from the corner, a sign with an anvil and a hammer. Master Gorin. Killian remembered the name. In his past life, he had never once been on this street. But in prison, one of his cellmates had told him about the armorer Jarek Tan, that very same Jarek, who in the future would become the best blacksmith in Aurelian, who would forge swords for the royal guard. He was 14 now. Right now, he's an apprentice to Master Gorin. The workshop was small and dark. The forge hummed. It smelled of red-hot metal and sweat. Master Gorin stood at the anvil, a heavy-set man with a bull's neck and small, angry eyes. Next to him, on his knees, was a boy, thin. His black hair was matted with sweat. He was picking up pieces of coal from the floor. There was a bruise on his cheekbone, fresh. Killian stood in the doorway. Gorin saw him. He recognized the crest on his doublet. He bowed and asked how he could be of service to the young gentleman. Killian looked around the workshop. Blades hung on the wall, ordinary ones. Rough-hewn work, suitable for guards or hunters. Nothing special. He asked if there was anything unusual. Gorin smirked. He said that everything on the wall was the best in the neighborhood. Killian shook his head. He said he wasn't looking for the best. He was looking for something strange. Gorin frowned. Then he shrugged and reached behind the counter. He pulled a blade out of a box, short, no hilt. The metal was a strange color, not silver, not steel, something in between. Goran said it was a flawed blade. An apprentice had messed up the tempering. The metal hadn't set right. It couldn't be sold or remelted. The boy got slapped in the face for it, 3 times. Killian took the blade. He turned it over in his hands. He ran his finger along the edge. He didn't know much about weapons, not then and not now, but he remembered one thing. In the future, Jarek Tan became famous for discovering a forging method in which the metal is hardened twice at different temperatures. This method was considered impossible. Every blacksmith who tried it ended up with ruined metal, because the second hardening required a precise temperature that no one could achieve. Except for Jarek, who achieved it by accident, at the age of 14, in Master Goran's workshop. And he got slapped in the face for it. Killian asked how much the blade cost. Goran laughed. He said the young gentleman didn't have to pay for a piece of ruined iron. Killian pulled a gold coin out of his wallet. A full-weight coin. A whole gold coin. For a blade without a hilt that, in the master's opinion, was only good for melting down. Goran stared at the coin. Then at Killian. Then at the coin again. He took it. The boy, Jarek, raised his head and looked up at Killian. His eyes were dark. There was no fear in them. There was something else. Surprise. And anger. The quiet, deep anger of a man who is being beaten for doing something new. Killian looked at him. Then he turned to Goran. He asked if he could hire an apprentice for some work around the house, minor repairs, hinges on the gate, locks. Goran shrugged. He said the boy was, if the young master wants to waste money on a fool, that's his business. Killian didn't argue. He said he'd send someone to pick up the boy tomorrow morning. He left the workshop. He carried the blade under his cloak. He stopped on the street. He took a deep breath. The air smelled of smoke and hot iron. Second. Meyer is first. Jarek is second. 5 remain. He walked further down Copper Street toward Herb Street. Herbalist Ha Don-su's shop stood on the corner. Small, crooked. The door was open. It smelled of dried herbs and something bitter. It was cramped inside. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were crammed with pots, pouches, and jars. An old man sat behind the counter, short, thin. His skin was dark from the southern sun. His eyes were narrow and watchful. Ha Dong-su, one of the best herbalists in the southern principality. He fled north 20 years ago. No one in Valenrit knew why. Killian knew. They told him in prison. Ha Dong-su had been treating the son of the southern prince. The boy died not from illness, but from poison slipped into his food by enemies. The herbalist was accused. He fled. Ever since then, he's been treating small merchants and beggars for copper coins. In 8 months, he'll be poisoned. By Meyer's men. Because Ha Dong-su is the only healer who agreed to work for the Ashtons, and because without a healer, the house will be defenseless against accusations. Killian walked into the shop. The old man looked up at him. He recognized the coat of arms. His expression didn't change. No bow, no smile. He asked how he could help. Killian said he couldn't sleep at night. Ha Dong-su nodded. He took a small bag from the shelf, valerian and motherwort, to be brewed before bed. 2 silver coins. Killian placed 6 silver coins on the counter, triple the price. The old man looked at the money, then at Killian. He didn't take it. He asked why so much. Killian said he wanted to ask a question. Ha Dong-su waited. Killian said he'd heard something strange. They say someone in town is buying up aconite. A lot of it. More than is needed for medicine. The old man froze. His fingers clenched on the counter. Aconite. Poison. The same poison used to kill the southern prince's son 20 years ago. Ha Dong-su knew what it meant when someone was buying up aconite. He slowly picked up the silver from the table. He looked Killian in the eyes, for a long time. Then he quietly said, "Thank you." Just one word. Killian nodded. He took the pouch of herbs and left. Out on the street, he stopped and leaned against a wall. His heart was pounding. 3 in one day. Meyer, Jarek, Ha-Dong-Soo. 4 left. But he mustn't rush. Every step leaves a trace. Every question raises new questions. If Cassius finds out that Killian is walking through the artisan quarters and handing out money to destitute craftsmen, he'll start to wonder. And when Cassius Myers starts thinking, people die. Killian headed home. On the way, he bought a book at the market. An old one, a well-worn one. An atlas of the continent of Aurelian with maps of all the provinces. For Leah. He remembered that as a child, his sister used to draw maps of imaginary countries with rivers, mountains, and cities that didn't exist. He remembered that once he'd found one of those maps on her desk and torn it up. Just like that. Because he could. He was 16. Leah didn't cry. She just picked up the scraps and went to her room. She never drew maps again. Killian clutched the book so tightly his fingers turned white. Back home, he went up to the second floor. He stopped at Leah's door. He stood there for a moment. He knocked. Silence. Then footsteps. The door opened a crack. Leah looked at him through the crack. She asked what he wanted. Her voice was even. Without anger, without interest. Empty. Killian held out the book. He said he'd found it at the market. He thought she might be interested in it. Leah looked at the book, then at him, then back at the book. She didn't take it. She asked why. Killian shrugged. He said he remembered how she used to draw maps. Leah turned pale. Just a tiny bit, but he noticed. She said she didn't draw anymore, not for a long time. Killian nodded. He set the book on the floor by the door. He said he'd leave it there. If she wanted it, she could take it. If not, he'd pick it up tomorrow. And he left. He didn't look back. But he heard the door open and close quietly a minute later. The book was gone from the floor. Cassius Myers had come in person, and Killian sensed that he had noticed the changes. Killian found Jarek Tan in the smithy and bought his blade for a gold piece. He warned the herbalist Ha-Dong-Soo about the aconite buyout. Leah took the book of maps, even though she had refused at first. A week passed. The Myers hunt took place without the Ashtons. Lord Ansel did not go. He did not tell his son why. But Killian saw that his father had shut himself in his study twice that week, rereading old contracts. The grain had sprouted. Jarek Tan arrived at the estate on the morning of the 4th day. Bertrand let him in through the back entrance. The boy stood in the courtyard and looked at the house as if he'd been brought to a royal palace. He was skinny. His shirt hung on him like a sack. The bruise on his cheek had turned yellow but hadn't faded. Killian went out to meet him. He said that, to start with, they needed to fix the hinges on the stable gate. The tools were in the shed. If he needed anything else, he should tell Bertrand. Jarek nodded. He didn't say a word. He walked toward the shed. Killian watched him go. 14 years old. In 8 years, this boy would be forging swords that would shatter other swords. In 10 years, he'll be invited to the court. In 12, his name will be known throughout Aurelian, but only if he survives the next 3 years. In his past life, Master Goran beat Jarek half to death after just half a year. The boy survived. He ran away. He spent 2 years begging. Then he found another master, then another. Then he opened his own forge. A long, bloody journey. Killian could have shortened it by years, simply by removing the boy from under Goran's fist. Around lunchtime, Killian went down to check on him. The hinges on the gate were fixed, but not just repaired. Jarek had reforged the old hinges, adding a second hinge to them. The gate now opened without a squeak and moved more smoothly than a new one. Bertrand stood nearby, watching with the look of someone who couldn't understand how a 14-year-old boy had done what an adult blacksmith had failed to do in 3 years. Killian told Bertrand that the boy would stay. Find him a room in the servants' wing. Feed him 3 times a day. Bertrand nodded. The next morning, Killian found a small iron figurine on his desk, a hawk, roughly made but recognizable, the Ashton coat of arms. Jarek had made it that night from scraps of iron he'd found in the shed. Killian placed the figurine on a shelf next to that very blade. 2 objects, the beginning of a collection. 6 days after Jarek moved in, something happened that Killian hadn't expected. Mir came to him on her own. He was sitting in the library, rereading old trade contracts of the House of Ashton. He was trying to figure out where to find money. The door creaked. Mire was standing in the doorway. Her hands were behind her back. Her eyes were downcast. She said she wanted to show him something, if the young gentleman wasn't busy. Killian closed the book. Mire pulled a small clay vial from behind her back. Rough, crooked, clearly handmade from kitchen clay. She held it out. Killian took it. He opened it and froze. The scent. A rose. But not just a rose with something else, with lemon, with something slightly bitter, fresh, like the morning air after rain. Lemon peel. She dried the peels on the windowsill just as he'd told her, and added them to the rose oil, all by herself, without a recipe, without a teacher, simply because it seemed to her that this was the right thing to do. Killian closed his eyes. He knew that scent. In 6 years, this perfume would be called Valenrit's Morning. People would buy it for gold. Barons' wives would stand in line for it. The queen of the southern principality would send a personal envoy to fetch it. And now he was holding it in his hands. The first bottle. A crooked clay bottle from the kitchen. He opened his eyes. Meyer was looking at him, waiting, afraid, braced for him to laugh, or throw them away, or say it was nonsense. Killian said it was the best thing he'd ever smelled. Meyer blinked. He said she needed a workshop, not a corner in the kitchen, a real room, with a north-facing window, with a table, with shelves for oils and herbs. Meyer shook her head. She said she was a servant, that she wasn't allowed to. Killian replied that now she was. He'd call her when the room was ready. Meyer left. She turned around at the threshold. She looked at him. Her eyes were wet. She didn't say anything. She just left. Killian sat there, holding the vial. Then he carefully placed it on the shelf, next to Jarek's blade, next to the iron hawk. 3 objects, 3 people. An hour later, her stepmother arrived, Lady Rowena, a beautiful woman of 35. Her light hair was perfectly styled, an expensive dress, a polite smile. She walked in without knocking. That was normal. His stepmother considered the whole house her own. She said she'd heard he'd refused the Myers' invitation to go hunting. Her voice was soft, sympathetic, concerned. Killian remembered that Rowena's brother, Lord David Thorne, would sign the denunciation against House Ashton in 8 months, the 15th signature out of 20. Rowena might not have known about it, or maybe she did. Killian wasn't sure. No one in prison had mentioned her name. But silence didn't mean innocence. He replied that he'd simply been busy. House affairs demanded his attention. Rowena sat down in an armchair. She said she was glad to see the change in him, that he looked better, that sobriety suited him. Then she asked if he was ill. Killian said he was fine. Rowena was silent for a moment. Then she said that Lord Myers was upset, that turning down the hunt was rude, that he shouldn't ruin his relationships with influential people. Killian looked at her. Rowena was smiling. It was the right kind of smile, warm and caring, but her eyes weren't smiling. They thought for a moment. Killian smiled back. He said she was right, that he would write a letter of apology to the Duke, and that he would definitely accept the next invitation. Rowena nodded. She stood up. As she was leaving, she paused by the shelf. She looked at the blade, at the clay flask, at the iron hawk. She asked what they were. Killian said they were trifles, souvenirs. Rowena shrugged and left. Killian sat and thought. Rowena would report to the Mears, there was no question about it, either through her brother or directly. She would tell them that Killian had changed, that he was sober, that he was taking an interest in the house's affairs, that he was turning down invitations. The Mears will start adjusting their plan. That means Killian has less time. He took his notes out of the drawer. He reread them. The contract to supply iron. If his father doesn't sign it while hunting, then the Mears will offer it again, in a different way, through another person. through someone closer, through Rowena, or through someone Killian doesn't remember. His memory wasn't perfect. He remembered major events, dates, names, but the small details slipped away, and every time he intervened, the future shifted. Like a river into which a stone has been thrown, the water flows on, but along a different course. That evening, he knocked on Leah's door again. This time, she opened it wider. He saw a book on her table, an atlas, open to a map of the northern provinces. A sheet of paper lay nearby, along with a quill. She was drawing. Not a map of an imaginary country, but a map of Valenrit, complete with trade routes. Killian asked if he could come in. Leah hesitated, then she stepped back. He entered. He sat down on a chair by the wall. He looked at the map. It was good, accurate, with details not found in the atlas. Leah had added them herself. Alleys, market squares, the layout of the shops. He asked how she knew the layout of the shops. Leah said she watched from the window, that she counted the carts every morning, that by the direction the carts took, she could tell where the goods were going. Killian felt a tightness inside. His 14-year-old sister, locked up in this house, without friends, without attention. She sat by the window and, out of loneliness, had learned to read the city by the movement of the wagons. He said the map was excellent. Leah shrugged. She said it was nonsense, just a pastime. Killian shook his head. He said no, it wasn't nonsense, it was useful. He asked if she could draw the routes of the caravans coming from the south, from the Mir's lands. Leah looked at him, for a long time. Then she asked why. Killian said he needed to know what the Myers were bringing into the city, and how much. Leah was silent. Then she said quietly that she could, in a week. Killian nodded. He stood up. He paused at the doorway. He said goodnight. Leah didn't reply, but as he closed the door, he saw that she was already sitting at the table, picking up a quill. Jarek moved into the estate and immediately demonstrated his talent by repairing the gate. Meyer created the first prototype of her future perfume using rose oil and lemon peel. Rowena visited Killian, and he realized that his stepmother was reporting to the Myers. Leah began drawing a map of the Myers' caravan routes at his request. In the second week, Killian went to the market for the first time, with a specific purpose in mind. He was looking for Kim Jia, a maid from House Chiron, 17 years old. In his past life, he hadn't even known she existed. He'd heard her name in prison. One of his cellmates, a former servant of the House of Chiron, had told him how a young maid had carried a note from Lord Chiron to their allies. The note was intercepted. The girl was hanged. And a week later, the House of Chiron met the same fate as the Ashtons. That cellmate said the girl was the smartest of anyone he knew, that she knew more about every resident of Valenrit than the city guard did, that if she'd been born into a different social class, she would have become an advisor at court. Killian found her at the Western Market. Gia was standing at a ribbon stall, haggling with the vendor, loudly, enthusiastically, with gusto, petite, quick. Her black hair was tied back in a ponytail. Her eyes sparkled. She talked non-stop. The vendor looked as if he wanted to crawl under the counter and stay there until closing time. Killian stopped nearby. He waited. Gia got the price cut to a third. She took the ribbon. She turned around. She saw the Ashton crest on his doublet. She took a step back, wary. She hadn't been to the Western Market. She usually shopped at the Central Market halls. If a young gentleman from the Great House was standing here, it meant something was wrong. Killian said he wanted to talk. Gia asked what about. He said he needed information about the city, about the people, about what was happening in Valenrit beyond the palaces and drawing rooms. Gia narrowed her eyes. She asked why her. Killian told the truth, because he had once heard that she knew more about this city than anyone else. Gia snorted. She asked who had told him that. Killian said he didn't remember. Gia was silent for about 5 seconds. Then she began to speak. She spoke for 12 minutes without stopping, about how the baker's wife on Mill Street secretly trades in contraband sugar from the Southern Principality, about how the captain of the night watch has dinner with his mistress every Friday at the tavern across the bridge, about how the new notary in Central Square is actually a former con artist from the port city and that his real name isn't Fried, but Morel. Killian froze. Notary Fried, the very one. The one who, in 10 months, would certify forged documents against the House of Ashton. His real name is Morel. Killian didn't know that. It wasn't in his notes from prison. New information. Valuable. He looked at Gia. She was standing there, waiting for his reaction, ready to run if necessary. He said she'd told him more in 5 minutes than his own father had in 5 years. Gia blinked. Then she smiled. She asked what that meant. Killian replied that he was offering her a job, to come to the Ashton estate once a week, to tell him what she'd heard, what she'd seen, what she knew. He would pay her a silver coin per visit. Gia looked at him with the expression of someone trying to figure out whether this was a joke or a trap. She asked if he was a pervert. Killian said no, that he needed information, nothing more, nothing less. Gia thought for a moment. Then she said she'd come. On Thursday. If she didn't like it, she'd leave and tell everyone that young Ashton pays for conversations. Killian agreed. She left. Quickly, lightly, without looking back. Killian stood in the market and thought about Notary Fried, who was actually Morel. That changed a lot. A con artist named Morel is far more vulnerable than the respected Notary Fried. A con artist has a past he wants to hide. He could play on that when the time came. He returned home around noon. An unfamiliar carriage was parked at the gate, black, without a coat of arms. Bertrand met him in the entryway, his face as white as a sheet. He said a guest had arrived, to see him personally. She identified herself as his fiancée, Celine Weir. Killian stopped short. Celine. He'd forgotten. No, he hadn't forgotten. He'd put it aside. Amid the whirlwind of those first few days, Meyer, Jarek, Leah, Hadongsu, Gia, so many names, so many plans, and Celine had been left behind. Just like in his past life, she was sitting in the small parlor, back straight, hands folded in her lap, blonde hair, a gray dress, simple, too simple for a baron's daughter. Killian remembered that the House of Vere had fallen on hard times long ago. Celine was the last thing the house had to offer, a living commodity in a pretty package. Their fathers had arranged the engagement when Killian was 15 and Celine was 16. He'd seen her about 6 times since then. Every time, he'd been drunk. Every time he told her something insulting. Or he said nothing at all, which was even worse. She stood up when he entered. She curtsied. Her movements were rehearsed, precise, like a doll's. Her eyes, Killian looked into her eyes. Light, gray, empty. No, not empty. Dead. The eyes of a person who had long since stopped expecting anything good to happen. He remembered. A month after his execution, Celine married another man, some minor lord from the East. She'd lived with him for 40 years. No one had ever once asked if she was happy. Killian didn't sit in the chair across from her as etiquette dictated. He sat next to her, on the chair beside her. Celine turned her head slightly. Surprise. The first sign of life on her face in 5 minutes. Killian said he wanted to tell her something. Celine waited. He said he had been a terrible fiancé. Every time they met, he was drunk, rude, and inattentive. That she deserved better, and that if she wanted to call off the engagement, he would sign the papers today. Celine didn't move. She didn't even blink. He continued. He said that if she decided to stay, he wanted to know one thing. Not what Dom Ware needed. Not what Dom Ashton needed. What she needed. What she herself wanted to do. Not for the family's sake. Not for the engagement's sake. For herself. Celine was silent. For a long time. A minute. 2. Killian waited. He didn't rush her. He didn't repeat himself. He just sat there beside her and waited. Celine lowered her eyes to her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly. Then she spoke. Quietly. So quietly that he could barely hear her. She said she knew how to count. She was very good at counting. That when she was a child, her father gave her accounting ledgers. That she found mistakes even the chief accountant had missed. That she was 8 years old and could already count faster than grown men. Then she was told that girls didn't need to know how to count, that she needed to learn to embroider and dance and smile. She fell silent. Killian nodded. He said that the House of Ashton didn't have a proper accountant, that Master Claude was old and tired, that the finances were in a disastrous state, and that he needed someone who could count better than anyone else. Celine looked up. There was something in her eyes, a tiny spark, like a match lit in a dark room. She asked if this was a job offer or a joke. Killian replied that it was an offer, a real one. She could come tomorrow. Master Claude would hand over all the ledgers to her. She would look them over and tell him what she thought. If she liked it, she'd stay. If not, he wouldn't insist. Celine looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. Once, briefly. She stood up, bowed, left. At the door, she turned around, asked what had happened to him. Killian asked what she meant. She said he was different, completely different. Killian was silent for a moment. Then he said he'd just woken up. Celine looked at him for another 3 seconds, and for the first time during her entire visit, the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. Not a smile, a hint of a smile. She left. Killian was left alone. 5. Meyer, Jarek, Ha-Dong-Soo, Jia, Celine. 5 people. He sat in the living room and looked at his hands. The same thin, useless hands. But now there were threads in those hands. Thin, invisible threads stretching toward 5 people, each of whom, alone, meant nothing. Together, they were the foundation, the bedrock, upon which the house could be rebuilt. The next day, Celine arrived in the morning. Ma Claude gave her the ledgers for the past 3 years. She sat in the library until evening. She didn't eat, she didn't drink tea, she just did the math. By sunset, she went to see Killian with 3 sheets of paper. The first listed expenses that could be cut immediately. The second listed debts that could be restructured. The third showed a figure, the total debt of the House of Ashton. Killian looked at the figure. It was more than he'd thought, significantly more. Celine said that at current spending levels, the house would go bankrupt in 8 months without outside intervention. 8 months. Killian remembered that the execution was scheduled for a year from now. So bankruptcy came first, then the indictment, then the block. The Meyers weren't in a hurry. They were waiting for the house to collapse on its own, and then they'd finish it off. Celine asked what he was going to do. Killian looked at the 3 sheets of paper, then at her. He said that, to start with, he'd do everything on the first list. Then he'd tackle the second, and she should keep the third sheet. In 6 months, they'd look at it again, and the number would be different. Celine raised an eyebrow. She asked where his confidence came from. Killian replied that he had a plan. Celine was silent for a moment. Then she said that a plan was good, but without money, a plan was just words. Killian nodded. She was right. Money. He needed money. Not in 6 months. Now. Immediately. He'd been thinking about it all evening. And that night, lying in the dark, he found the answer. Perfume. The bottle of Meyer. A crooked clay bottle with a scent that, in 6 years, would be worth a baron's annual income. But in 6 years, it would be too late. He needed it now. And that's when he realized he didn't need to wait 6 years. He didn't need to wait until Meyer became famous. He needed just one thing, one sale, to just the right person, someone who would understand that this scent was worth a fortune. Killian knew such a person, Countess Eliza Dane, patron of the arts, the richest woman in Valenrit after the Queen. In her past life, she would be the first buyer of Meyer's perfume in 4 years' time. She was in town now. She was hosting a ball in a week, and Killian had been invited, because Countess Dane invited everyone, even the drunken fools from the dying houses. He closed his eyes. The plan was taking shape. Crooked, unreliable, built on people who didn't yet know they were great. But it was a plan, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, Killian Ashton knew what he was doing. There were 4 days left until Countess Dane's ball. Killian spent them preparing. He needed a bottle, not a crooked clay pot from the kitchen. A real one, a beautiful one that the Countess would take it in her hands and not put it back. He went down to Mira in the morning. She was standing in her corner of the kitchen. Killian noticed that lemon peels lay in neat rows on the windowsill of the north-facing window. Dried just right. Thin, almost transparent. Mira dried them every day, without being reminded. He said he needed another bottle, just like the first one, but better. Mira looked at him and, for the first time, didn't look away. She asked what better meant. Killian thought for a moment. He didn't know anything about perfumes. He didn't understand anything about oils, essences, or notes. But he remembered one thing. In the future, Mira became famous not for creating beautiful scents. She became famous because her perfumes changed. In the morning, they smelled one way. By evening, another. As if the scent were alive. As if it grew along with the day. Killian told her this, not as an order, but as a thought. He said it would be nice if the scent in the morning were different from the scent in the evening. Mira frowned. Then her eyes widened. She understood something. Something clicked inside her. She nodded and turned back to her pots. Killian left. He knew he didn't need to stand over her. He didn't need to explain. Mira was a genius. She needed only one thing. For someone to tell her it was possible. She'd figure the rest out on her own. Now for the vial. Killian went to find Jarek. The boy was working in the courtyard, repairing the old grate over the well. His hands were black with soot, but his eyes were alive. In the week he'd been at the estate, he'd changed, not on the outside, but on the inside. He no longer flinched when someone walked by. He didn't tuck his head into his shoulders. He slept in a proper bed. He ate 3 meals a day. Simple things. For a 14-year-old boy from Master Goran's smithy, it was a whole new world. Killian asked if he could make a small thing, out of metal, a case for a vial, the size of a palm, beautiful, engraved. Jarek looked at his hands, then at Killian. He asked what the engraving should be. Killian thought for a moment. A hawk, he said, the Ashton coat of arms. No, he paused, not a hawk, a rose, a simple rose. Jarek nodded. He said he'd have it ready in 2 days. Killian left. That left the third thing. Clothes. He couldn't show up at Countess Dane's ball in a linen shirt, but spending money on a new doublet was out of the question. Celine had already explained to him that every gold coin counted. He went to see Bertrand. He asked if there was anything presentable among his father's old things. Bertrand paused. Then he said there was one doublet, dark blue. Lord Ansel had worn it 20 years ago when he was courting Killian's mother. It had been hanging in the back of the closet ever since. Bertrand brought the doublet. The fabric was good, heavy, though slightly faded at the shoulders. But the cut was classic, without any frills. No gold embroidery, no ostentatious luxury. The doublet of a man who knows his worth and needs no proof of it. Killian tried it on. It was a little loose in the shoulders. His father had been broader in his youth, but it would do. Bertrand looked at him and the old man's eyes sparkled again. He said the young gentleman looked just like his father, the father Bertrand remembered in every way. Killian nodded. He didn't reply, afraid his voice would tremble. On the evening of the third day, Meyer brought a new bottle. This time, she'd found an old glass medicine bottle in the pantry. She washed it, she filled it. Killian opened it and took a deep breath. Morning, freshness. Lemon and rose and something else. Something that hadn't been in the first version. He looked at Mire. She was standing there, waiting, her hands behind her back. But there was no fear in her eyes. There was anticipation. She wanted to know if she had understood correctly. Killian nodded. Mire exhaled. Then she said quietly that she had added some dried jasmine, just a little, so that by evening, when the top note faded, a warm scent would remain. Killian closed the bottle. She understood. No teacher, no books, no recipes. Simply because she had a gift. The gift of distinguishing 16 shades of smoke from different types of wood. The gift of sensing scent the way other people sense music. On the morning of the 4th day, Jarek brought the case. Killian took it in his hands and forgot to breathe for a second. A small word made of dark metal, heavy, smooth. A rose on the lid, not carved, forged. The petals as thin as paper, each one veined. It wasn't just an engraving, it was a work of art. A 14-year-old boy who, just a week ago, didn't even have a proper bed, had created something that took his breath away. Killian placed the bottle of Mire into Jarek's case. He closed the lid. He turned it over in his hands. Perfect. 2 geniuses, 15 and 14 years old. One created the scent, the other created a home for it, and neither of them knew they were holding the future in their hands. The Countess Dane's ball was that evening. Killian got dressed. His father's doublet, clean boots, hair slicked back, no rings except the family heirloom, no cologne. He looked in the mirror. A stranger was looking back at him. Not a drunken reveler, not a young fool with bloodshot eyes. A man, young, serious, with the face of someone who knows what he's doing. Bertrand handed him his cloak at the door. He said quietly that Lady Ashton would be pleased. Killian buttoned his cloak. He stepped outside. Countess D stood in the upper quarter of Valenrit. White stone, tall windows, a garden with fountains. Carriages stood in front of the entrance, the coats of arms of the great houses, the golden tree of the Danes, the black lion of the Mears, the silver star of the Karens, and among them, the Ashton family's small hawk on a worn single-horse carriage. Killian entered. The hall was enormous. Candles, music, the scent of expensive perfume, roasted meat, and fresh flowers. Hundreds of people. Silk, velvet, and gold. He stood at the entrance and felt every pair of eyes in the hall turn toward him. Not because he was important, because he was the entertainment. Young Ashton, a drunken fool. Everyone was waiting for the show. Someone would be the first to raise a glass. In an hour, there'd be a scandal. In 2 hours, the servants would escort him out. Just another evening. Killian made his way through the hall, past the tables with wine, past the trays with goblets. He didn't stop once. He didn't reach out once. He could feel a ripple running through the hall. Whispers. Ashton walked past the wine. Ashton is sober. What's going on? He found Countess Dane by the far wall, a tall woman in her 50s. Her gray hair was styled in an elaborate updo, a dark gold dress, a string of pearls around her neck. Her eyes were intelligent, alert. She saw him and raised an eyebrow simply. Killian bowed, neutral, no frills. He said he was grateful for the invitation. The Countess nodded. She said she was glad to see him in good health. There was irony in her voice, subtle, polite. She remembered his past visits. Everyone did. Killian said he'd brought a gift. He pulled a case from behind his belt. He held it out. The Countess took it. She turned it over in her hands. She saw a rose on the lid. Her eyebrows rose higher. She opened the lid. She took out the bottle. She looked at it, then at Killian. Then she brought it to her nose and froze. Killian saw that moment. Countess Dane was not just a wealthy woman. She was a collector. She bought up works by masters from across the continent, paintings, fabrics, weapons, perfumes. Over the course of 50 years, she had tried every fragrance produced by Aurelian. She knew scents as well as Meyer did, perhaps not quite as subtly, but enough to understand. What she was now holding in her hands had never existed before. The Countess closed her eyes, took another breath, opened her eyes, looked at Killian, and for the first time that evening, there was no irony in her gaze. There was attention, genuine, keen, like that of a hunter who had spotted its prey. She asked who had made it. Killian replied that it was a perfumer who worked for the House of Ashton. A young perfumer. The Countess looked at the bottle again, then at the case. She ran her finger over the rose petals. She asked if that was made by the same person. Killian nodded. Another perfumer, also from the House of Ashton. The Countess closed the case. She pressed it to her chest. She said she wanted to order more, 10 vials by fall. Killian shook his head. He said 10 was impossible. The perfumer worked slowly, 3 vials by winter, and the price would be high. The Countess smiled, for the first time that evening, a genuine smile. She said the price didn't scare her, and that she wanted to meet the perfumer in person. Killian replied that he would pass on the message. The Countess nodded. Then she leaned toward him and whispered that she didn't know what had happened to young Ashton, but whatever it was, let it continue. Killian bowed and left, across the entire hall, past the tables with wine, past the whispering guests, past Cassius Myers, who was standing by a column with a glass, staring at him without blinking. Killian caught his gaze, for a single second, and he saw in those eyes not anger, not irritation, interest, the cold, calculating interest of a predator who realized that his prey had changed. Killian stepped out into the night. The air was cold, fresh. He stood on the steps of the mansion and counted. 3 vials by winter. The Countess would pay in gold. A lot of gold. That money would be enough to pay off the most urgent debts on Celine's list. The first step. A tiny one, but the first. The money from Countess Dane arrived 3 days later. A down payment. 20 gold coins for 3 future vials. Celine accepted the pouch of coins and, for the first time in all the time Killian had known her, smiled genuinely. Not a shadow, not a tremor of her lips, a smile. She said it would last 2 months if they cut back on expenses from the first list. Killian nodded. 2 months of life, bought with the scent of lemon, rose, and jasmine. He ordered the cuts to be made that very day. His stepmother's budget for dresses was slashed. Rowena came to him an hour later. Her eyes were ablaze. Her voice rang out. She said it was humiliating, that she was Lord Ashton's wife, that she was entitled to a certain standard of living. Killian listened, silently. When she finished, he replied that the house was in dire financial straits, that the cuts applied to everyone, including himself, including his father, that he had already cut back on his personal expenses for wine and entertainment. Rowena fell silent. She looked at him. A calculating look flashed in her eyes. She asked who made such decisions, him or his father. Killian replied that it was his father. It was a lie. His father didn't know about the cutbacks. But Rowena couldn't go and check, because if she went to Lord Ansel with complaints about the budget cuts, he would wonder why his wife needed so much money. And when Lord Ansel started wondering, he could be unnervingly perceptive. Rowena left. 2 days later, Killian learned from Gia that Rowena had sent a letter to her brother, to Lord David Thorne. Gia didn't know what was in the letter, but she knew the messenger was the kind they hire when they don't want strangers to see the letter. Killian made a note of it. Rowena was on edge. A nervous Rowena is dangerous. A week after the ball, something happened that Killian hadn't expected, an event that wasn't in his memory, because it hadn't happened in his past life. Jarek was gone. In the morning, the boy wasn't in his room. The bed was made. His things were in place. The iron hammer he'd been working with lay on the table, but Jarek was gone. Bertrand searched the estate, the courtyard, the stables, the barn. Nowhere. Killian stood in the middle of the courtyard and felt a chill rise from his stomach to his throat. This wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't in his memory. In his past life, Jarek had stayed with Master Goran for another 6 months. Then he ran away, but on his own, of his own free will. Now Jarek was here, safe, and he had vanished. Something had changed, something Killian hadn't foreseen. He sent Bertrand to Copper Street to check on Master Goran's workshop. He himself went to the gate. An old dog was standing by the gate. The very same one, the red-haired one, with a torn ear. In a past life, Killian had kicked him away for his dirty boots. In this life, the dog waited for him at the gate every morning, wagging his tail. Killian crouched down beside him. He petted the dog on the head. He thought, who could have taken Jarek? Master Goran, perhaps. He might have come at night and demanded the workshop, although he had already been paid. The Meyers? Unlikely. They didn't know about Jarek. Not yet, anyway. Or maybe they did. If Cassius had already started digging, if he'd been following Killian after the ball, if he'd seen the case in the Countess's hands and wanted to find out who made it. Killian stood up. He went to see Meyer. She was in the kitchen. He asked if she'd seen Jarek last night. Meyer nodded. She said she'd seen him in the courtyard after dinner. He was sitting by the wall, drawing something on a piece of leather. Drawing? Killian asked what he was drawing. Meyer shrugged. She said she couldn't make it out. Some kind of sketch. Killian went back to Jarek's room. He searched it. Under the mattress, he found a piece of leather. There was a sketch on it. A blade. But not just any blade. Long, curved, with a double groove along the blade. And notes. Temperatures. Heating time. Cooling time. Jarek was designing a new blade and writing down the technique. His own technique. Double tempering. Killian clenched the piece of leather. The boy isn't just talented. He's obsessed. He thinks about metal every second. And if he left on his own, he went somewhere where he can work with metal. Not to repair hinges, to forge. Bertrand returned 2 hours later. Goran's workshop was closed. The neighbors said Goran had left last night, with his apprentice. No, not with Jarek, with someone else. Goran was gone and the workshop was empty. Killian understood. Jarek went to Goran's workshop, at night, because there's a forge there, because there's no forge at the estate, because the boy wanted to try out his design, his double hardening technique, and he couldn't wait. Killian ran. Through the streets of Valenrit, through the central district, past the shopping arcades, to Copper Street. The workshop was the third one from the corner. The door was closed, but smoke was coming from the chimney. The forge was working. Killian pushed the door. It was locked from the inside. He knocked. Silence. Then footsteps. The bolt slid back. The door opened. Jarek, black with soot. His eyes were red from the smoke, fresh burns on his hands. He looked up at Killian. There was neither fear nor remorse on his face, only stubbornness. Killian stepped inside. A blade lay on the anvil, still hot, reddish-orange at the edges, the very one. From the blueprint, long, curved, with a double groove. Jarek had forged it overnight, all by himself, in an empty workshop, without help, at 14 years old. Killian looked at the blade, then at the boy. He could have scolded him, could have said he wasn't supposed to leave without warning, that it was dangerous, that Master Goran might return. Instead, he asked if it had turned out right. Jarek was silent. Then he said quietly that he didn't know, that they'd have to wait until it cooled down, that he'd done a double tempering but wasn't sure if the temperature had been right. Killian nodded. He said they'd wait together. He sat down on the floor by the wall. Jarek stood for a moment. Then he sat down beside him. They waited for an hour, in silence. When the blade had cooled, Jarek picked it up. He turned it over in his hands, ran his finger along the edge. His eyes widened. He turned to Killian, and for the first time in all the time they'd known each other, the boy smiled. Broadly, openly, like a child. Because he was a child. It had worked. The double tempering had worked just right. The metal was different, not silver and not steel. Something in between, something new. Killian looked at the blade and thought that he was holding a weapon that, in 6 months' time at the Council of Seals, would cleave the ceremonial sword of a ducal warrior in two. But he said only one thing, that they needed to get back before lunch, and that he would buy this workshop from Goran. Jarek looked at him, then at the horn, then back at Killian. He didn't say anything, but Killian saw how the boy pressed the blade to his chest, with both hands, the way you hold something that isn't just an object, the way you hold a part of yourself. They returned to the estate around noon. Bertrand exhaled as if he hadn't breathed since morning. Meyer stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Jarek, then at Killian, then back at Jarek, and very quietly said she was glad he'd been found. Jarek blushed, from his ears to his neck. The first person besides Killian to tell him he was glad to see him. That evening, Killian sat in his study and did the math. Goran's workshop. Goran had left. He might not return. But the workshop wasn't his property. It belonged to the Copper Street Blacksmiths Guild. Rent costs money. Money he doesn't have. Or almost doesn't have. He took out Celine's list. The Countess's deposit, 20 gold pieces. Minus the debts from the first list, that leaves 7. The workshop rent, 5 gold pieces a month. 2 months. Then the money would run out. If there was no new income by then, the estate would once again be on the brink. Killian leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes. He needed more. More orders, more money, more time. But time was the only thing you couldn't buy. A month had passed. 30 days that had transformed the Ashton estate beyond recognition. Not on the outside. Outwardly, everything was the same. Weathered walls, peeling paint on the gate, an old one-horse carriage. But inside, the house was breathing. Meyer was given a room in the north wing. Killian personally carried a table and shelves there. Bertrand hung a curtain on the window. Jarek made a lock. When Meyer first entered her workshop, she stood in the doorway for 5 minutes. She just stood there and looked around. Then she turned to Killian and said one word. "Thank you." He nodded and left. He didn't come in. It was her door, one she could close. For the first time in her life, the 15-year-old girl with burned hands had a space that belonged only to her. Jarek worked in Goran's workshop every day. Killian arranged the lease through the guild, 5 gold pieces a month. Jarek forged from dawn till dusk. A week later, his first customer came to him, a merchant from the Eastern Market who needed hinges for chests. A small job. But Jarek made double-hinged hinges, just like the ones he'd repaired on the estate's gate. The merchant told another merchant. That one told a third. 2 weeks later, Jarek had 5 orders, small ones, but steady. The workshop began to bring in money. Not much, 2 silver coins a day, a drop, but a drop that fell every day. Celine counted every single one of them. Ha Dong-soo had changed the lock on the shop. His granddaughter, Yinju, came to the Ashton estate once a week. She brought herbal concoctions for Lord Ansel, a tincture for insomnia for Killian, hand ointment for Meyer. She was sharp-tongued, straightforward. She wore men's clothes. She said it was uncomfortable to knead clay for crucibles in a skirt. She was 22 years old and considered them parasites. She looked at Killian with open suspicion. Every visit. He didn't try to change her mind. He simply paid for the medicine on time and didn't haggle. Yinju noticed this. Silently. Jia came on Thursdays. Every Thursday. She would sit in an armchair in the small living room and talk non-stop. An hour. Sometimes an hour and a half. Killian listened. He took notes. Then he compared them with what he remembered from his past life. 80% matched. 20% was new. The world was shifting. Slowly, like a heavy door on rusty hinges. But it was shifting. In the 3rd week, Jia brought news that made Killian freeze. The House of Chiron was negotiating with the Mears. Secretly, through an intermediary. Lord Chiron and the Duke of Mears had met at the tavern across the bridge. Twice in the past week. In his past life, House Chiron had remained neutral, until the very end. They hadn't supported the Ashtons, but they hadn't betrayed them either. They were wiped out 6 months after the Ashtons, separately, in a different way. Now the Mears were trying to pull the Chirons to their side sooner. Why? Because Killian had changed the balance of power. Because the Ashtons didn't show up for the hunt. because Killian is sober, because Countess Dane bought perfume. Small changes, ripples on the water, and the Mears reacted. They're looking for new allies. They're strengthening their positions. They're preparing for the possibility that the Ashtons might turn out to be stronger than expected. Killian pulled out his notes. House Chiron, Lord Randall Chiron. Cautious, greedy, but not evil. In his past life, indecision was his downfall. He took too long to choose a side and ultimately lost to both. His maid, Gia, was carrying a note to those who might be able to help, but the note was intercepted, and Chiron and Gia and all the servants perished. Killian couldn't let that happen again. He needed House Chiron, not as an ally, not yet, as a neutral party, as a buffer between the Ashtons and the Meyers. If Chiron sided with the Meyers, it would reduce his room to maneuver to 0. He thought about it for 2 days. Then he did what he did best. He found the right person. Leah. Her map of the Meyers' caravan routes was ready, detailed, accurate, with dates and the number of wagons. Killian sat at the table studying it. Leah stood nearby, silently, waiting. He noticed one line, a route that didn't lead to the Meyers' warehouses, but to the port, 3 times a week, 1 convoy, always at night. He asked Leah what it was. She said she didn't know, but that these convoys traveled without an escort of guild guards. Regular convoys always had guards. These didn't. Smuggling. The Meyers were transporting something to the port to avoid guild duties. If this came to light, the guild won't forgive it. Duties are sacred, even for the great houses. Killian rolled up the map. He looked at Leah. He said she'd just given him a weapon worth more than 10 swords. Leah looked at him. There was something new in her eyes. Not wariness, not coldness. Interest. Lively. Sharp. She asked what he was going to do. Killian replied that nothing yet. It was too early. But when the time came, this map would be the deciding factor. Leah nodded. Then she said she could make another one. The routes of the night convoys over the last 3 months, from memory. She'd been counting the wagons from the window every night. For 3 months, from memory. Killian looked at his sister and thought that this world didn't deserve her. He said, "Please." Leah went to her room. She turned around at the threshold. She said it would be ready tomorrow, and she left, without saying goodnight. But without closing the door either. The door remained ajar, just a crack. Killian stood in the hallway and looked at that gap, and he thought that Leah's slightly ajar door was worth more than the Dane family's 20 gold piece decanter. At the end of the month, an invitation arrived, not from the Meyers, from the Council of Seals, an official one, with the royal seal. Every great house is required to appear in 5 months, to present evidence of their usefulness to the crown. Masters, orders, guilds. A house that failed to provide sufficient evidence would lose its coat of arms, and with it, everything. Killian held the invitation in his hands and felt it burning his fingers. 5 months. That was the deadline. Clear, unchangeable, independent of the Meyers, Cassius, or Rowena. In 5 months, House Ashton must stand before the council and prove that it had the right to exist. In their past life, the Ashtons had failed this council, because they had nothing to show. Now Killian had Meyer, Jarek, Hadansu, Leah's maps, and Seelan's calculations. 5 people, 5 months. Would that be enough? He didn't know, but he knew there was no choice. 6 weeks after waking up, Killian encountered Lorelei Mears for the first time. It didn't happen at a ball or at a reception. It happened at the market. He was walking down Silk Alley, looking for fabric for Meyer. She needed little bags for dried herbs, thin ones, breathable ones. Linen wouldn't work. Meyer explained that linen traps moisture. She needed silk, cheap, undyed. Killian didn't know such a thing existed, but he went looking for it, and at the 3rd stall from the corner, he saw her. Lorelei was standing at the counter, examining a ribbon, golden hair down to her shoulders, a blue dress, lightweight, a thin silver chain around her neck. She was beautiful, so beautiful that passers-by slowed their pace. Killian froze. In his past life, he had seen Lorelei Mears 3 times. The first time was at a ball. He was drunk. He said something stupid to her. She smiled. Politely, emptily. The second time was at the Duke's reception. He was drunk again. She smiled again. The 3rd time was in court. She stood before the judges. She was crying, beautifully, convincingly. She said that Lord Ansel Ashton had threatened her, that he had tried to force her to remain silent, that she feared for her life. Every word a lie, every tear rehearsed. And the judges believed her, because who wouldn't believe a weeping beauty from the great house? Lorelei was a weapon, forged since childhood. Every gesture, every smile, every glance, everything calculated, everything according to the script. Killian knew this, and he knew something else, that beneath this weapon, somewhere inside, was a girl whom no one had ever asked what she wanted. He could have left. He should have left. Lorelei Myers is a danger. Every minute spent with her is information that will reach the Duke. Every word will be recorded, analyzed, and used. But Killian remembered one more thing. In the end, when the Myers go to open war, Lorelei will be the one person for whom the Duke won't be able to give his final order, because by then, she'll no longer be a weapon. If someone shows her that she can be a human being. He walked up to the stall, stood beside it, asked the merchant for undyed silk, thin, for little pouches. The merchant reached under the counter. Lorelei turned her head. She saw him. She recognized him. A smile appeared on her face. That very one, polite, empty, automatic. Like a doll whose strings had been pulled. She said she was glad to see him, that she'd heard he'd changed, that all of Valenrit was talking about young Ashton, who no longer drank. Her voice was soft, warm. Every word was even, polished, like a blade. Killian looked at her, not at her smile, at her eyes. Her eyes weren't smiling. Her eyes were calculating. He replied that yes, he had changed, that it turned out the world was more interesting when viewed through sober eyes. Lorelei tilted her head slightly, a standard gesture. It signifies interest. On page 42 of the etiquette textbook. Killian knew this because Celine had once told him that at bridal school, they were taught to tilt their heads exactly 15 degrees. He didn't play along. Instead, he pulled a small bottle out of his pocket. One of Meyer's sample bottles. Not the one he'd given to Graf. Simpler, but with the same character. He held it out to Lorelei, said it was a gift, from the master at the House of Ashton. Lorelei took the vial. Automatically, like accepting a business card. She opened it, brought it to her nose, and for 1 second, for one tiny second, her face changed. The mask wavered. It didn't fall off, it just wavered, like a pane of glass hit by a pebble. She closed the bottle. She smiled, politely again, but a little slower than before. She said it was lovely, that she'd definitely try it. Killian nodded. He said one sentence. He said it was the only scent in the world that wasn't made to charm anyone, just because someone felt like making it. Lorelei froze, for half a second. Her fingers tightened around the bottle a little more. Then she nodded, said goodbye, left. Beautiful, graceful. The way people leave when they know they're being watched. Killian stood there, watching her go. He had just given the Myerses some information. Lorelei would tell the Duke that Ashton makes perfumes, that he has a master perfumer. It was dangerous, but he was playing the long game, not for months, for years, and Lorelei Myers was a figure who could not be ignored. That evening, he sat in his study. He reviewed his notes. He crossed out what no longer applied. He added new details. His memory of the future was melting away, like ice in the spring sun. He still remembered the major events clearly, the Council of Seals, the indictment, the execution, but the details were slipping away. The name of the innkeeper where the Myers and the Karens had met. He'd remembered it a week ago. Now there was only a void. The date when Captain Olsen of the Guard would receive his first bribe from the Myers. It had been in his head. Now it's blurred. Half a year of certain knowledge. That's what he thought on the first day. A month and a half has passed, and already a fifth of the details are lost. He's interfering less than he intended, but every intervention shifts everything else. Like a stone in a river, the water flows on. But the riverbed has already changed, and his map of the riverbed is becoming obsolete faster than he can draw a new one. He needed a new map, one of his own, built not on memory, but on people. Gia knew the present. Leah saw the routes. Celine counted the money. Yinju brought gossip from Grass Street. Meyer and Jarek created value. Each of them saw their own piece of the mosaic. Killian saw all the pieces at once, while he could still see. A knock at the door. Yinju. She walked in without being invited. As always, she sat down in an armchair. She set a jar of ointment on the table. She said it was for Meyer, a new formula. Grandpa had added camphor. It would help burns heal better. Killian thanked her. Yinju didn't leave. She sat there and looked at him. He waited. She said Grandpa had asked her to pass on a message. Aconite. the one Killian had asked about. People were indeed buying it up. Grandpa had checked with some old acquaintances on Herb Street. The buyer hadn't given his name, but he'd paid in gold. A lot. Killian nodded. He asked when. Yinju replied that it was 3 weeks ago, before Killian came to the shop. So the aconite had been bought before he issued his warning. The poison is already in someone's hands. The question is, whose, and for whom? Yinju looked at him. Then she said what he had been expecting and at the same time not expecting. She said he wasn't as stupid as he pretended to be, and she asked who he really was. Killian looked into her eyes. Dark, direct, without guile, without calculation, just a question, an honest one. He replied that he was Killian Ashton, the very same one. He'd just woken up one morning and decided that enough was enough. Yinju was silent. Then she said she didn't believe him, but she'd stay, because he paid on time and didn't haggle, and because Meyer had become a different person in just 1 month. And if that was thanks to him, then she didn't care who he really was. She stood up. She left. She turned around at the threshold. She said that if he hurt her grandfather, she'd poison him herself. Killian replied that he had no doubt she would. Yinju snorted, and she left. The door closed behind her. Killian sat there, staring at the jar of ointment. 6. Meyer, Jarek, Leah, Celine, Jia, Yinju. 6 people around him. 6 threads. 6 pieces of the mosaic. Save at least 7. He needs 1 more. Killian ran into Lorelei Myers at the market and gave her a bottle of Myers perfume. His memory of the future began to fade faster than he'd expected. Yinju reported that the aconite had been bought up even before Killian's warning, and the poison was already in someone's possession. For the first time, she told him outright that she didn't believe in his reincarnation, but decided to stay. Killian has 6 people, and he needs a 7th. 2 months after Killian's awakening, he was struck for the first time. Not with a fist, with money. In the morning, a notary arrived at the estate. Not Freed, someone else. Young, polite, with a folder of papers. He introduced himself as an assistant to the city treasurer and reported that the House of Ashton had an unpaid debt to the Valenrit Merchants Guild. The amount was so high that Celine turned pale. 420 gold pieces. Killian didn't remember this debt, not from his past life. He hadn't been there. This was something new, something created in response to his actions. He asked for the papers. The notary handed them over. Killian read them. Celine stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. The debt was registered in the name of Lord Ansel Ashton, the estate's seal, a signature, the date, 3 months ago. Killian looked at the signature, then at Celine. She nodded almost imperceptibly. It wasn't his father's signature. It looked similar, very similar, but over the past month, Celine had reviewed every document from the house dating back 3 years. She knew Lord Ansel's handwriting like the back of her hand, and this wasn't him. A forgery. The Myers. They'd stopped waiting. They'd struck first. Killian looked up at the notary. The young man stood with an expressionless face, professional detachment. But Killian noticed one thing. His fingernails, bitten down to the flesh. This man was nervous. Killian asked through which firm the debt had been registered. The notary gave a name. Frida's firm, Notary Frida's, who was, in fact, the con artist Morel. Killian didn't let on that the name was familiar to him. He thanked the notary and said that the firm would review the claim and respond in a week. The notary left. Celine closed the door. She turned to Killian. Her eyes were like 2 gray stones. She said the signature was forged, that the document could be contested, but that would require a formal hearing, in city court, before Judge Dorn. Judge Dorn, who takes bribes through his wife, who, in 8 months, would be handing down the Ashton family's sentence, whom the Myers had bought off long before any of this. The trial would be a farce. Killian knew that. Celine seemed to know it too, or sense it. She asked if there was another way. Killian thought about it, for a long time. Then he said there was. Not court, a notary. If the document is notarized by Freed, and if Freed isn't Freed but Morel, then the document itself becomes invalid, because it was notarized by someone using a false name. This isn't a matter for the court, it's a matter for the Notaries Guild. And in the Notaries Guild, the Myers don't have as much influence as they do in city court. Celine looked at him. She asked how he knew the notary's real name. Killian replied that he'd heard it from someone. Celine was silent for a moment. Then she nodded. She didn't ask. She was doing that more and more often. She noticed that something was off with Killian, and she didn't ask, because she felt good. Because for the first time in her life, someone had asked her what she wanted, and she didn't want to ruin that with questions. Killian went to see Gia, not on Thursday, an unscheduled visit. He found her at the east gate of the market. She was selling a ribbon to someone, the very same ribbon she'd bought on the day they met, at a markup, double the price. Killian waited until she was done. Then he said he needed information, everything she knew about the notary Fried. Gia narrowed her eyes. She asked why. Killian said that Fried had forged a document against the House of Ashton. Gia stopped smiling, for the first time since they'd met. She was silent for 10 seconds. Then she spoke, quickly, quietly, to the point. Fried, real name Morel. She'd already mentioned that, but there was something else. Morel had a wife, in a port city. He'd left her 5 years ago. He'd run off with his client's money. His wife was left with 3 children and debts. Now she lives in Valenright, on the outskirts. She works as a laundress. She doesn't know that her husband is also in Valenright, under a different name, 10 streets away from her. Killian paused. Morel's wife. Who could identify him? Who could confirm that Notary Fried is the fugitive con artist Morel? One testimony before the Notaries Guild. And all documents certified by Fried would become invalid, including the forged debt for 420 gold pieces. He asked Gia where his wife lived. Gia gave him the address. Then she added that the woman's name was Irma, that she was quiet, intimidated, that if anyone from the nobility came to her, she would hide and not open the door. Killian nodded. He wouldn't go to Irma himself. He would send Yinju. Yinju wouldn't know. Yinju wears men's clothes and needs clay for crucibles. Yinju could talk to the laundress without scaring her. He returned home. He found Yinju. She had come with another batch of herbal decoctions for her father. Killian explained, briefly, without going into detail. There's a woman, a laundress, Irma. Her husband is a con artist who forges documents under someone else's name. If Irma agrees to confirm this before the Notaries Guild, the House of Ashton will be spared from the fraudulent debt. Yinju listened, silently. Then she asked one thing. What would happen to Irma afterward? Killian hadn't expected that question. But he should have. Yinju always thought about people, about those at the bottom, those who cannot be seen from the palaces and parlors. If Irma speaks out against Morel, he'll find out, and he'll come for her. Killian replied that Irma and the children would be taken to the Ashton estate. They'd be given a room, work, protection. Yinju looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded and left. The next day she returned with Irma, a small woman in her 30s, pale, thin, her hands red from doing laundry. 3 children, aged 5 to 9. They stood in the estate's courtyard and looked at the house just as Jarek had on his first day, as if it's something impossible. Irma was trembling. Yinju stood beside her. She put a hand on her shoulder. Killian approached. He crouched down in front of the children. The oldest boy looked up at him from under his eyebrows. The youngest girl was hiding behind her mother. The middle one just remained silent. Killian didn't say anything to the children. He stood up. He looked at Irma. He told her that she and the children would be given a room, food, a job if she wanted one, that no one would harm them, that Morel wouldn't find out where they were, and that she would need to do just one thing, go to the Notaries Guild and tell the truth. Irma was crying, quietly, silently, the way people cry who are used to crying so that no one can hear them. She nodded. The next morning, Killian and Celine drove Irma to the Notaries Guild building. Irma went inside. Killian stayed outside. He waited. Celine stood nearby. She said nothing. An hour later, Irma came out. The head of the guild followed her out, an old man with a white beard and a stern gaze. He looked at Killian and said that the guild would begin an investigation immediately, that all documents certified by the person named Frida would be suspended pending clarification, including the promissory note from the House of Ashton. 420 gold pieces, frozen, with a single conversation. Killian nodded. He thanked them. He helped Irma into the carriage. They drove home. Celine was silent on the way. Then she said quietly that he was playing a dangerous game, that the Meyers wouldn't forgive him, that they would strike again, harder. Killian replied that he knew. Celine was silent for a moment. Then she said that if he ever told her the truth, she wanted to be the first to know. Killian looked at her. Her eyes were gray, calm, without reproach, without fear, just a request. He said he would tell her someday. Celine nodded and turned away toward the window. Irma, the laundress, a mother of 3, who had told the truth before the guild because a strange girl dressed in men's clothes had knocked on her door and said there was a place where she wouldn't be beaten. The 7th. Killian sat in the carriage and counted. Meyer, Jarek, Leah, Celine, Gia, Yinjo, Irma. 7. 7 people. Save at least 7. He closed his eyes, and for the first time he didn't feel that gaze on the back of his neck. For the first time in 2 months, that old, weary force wasn't watching him. It had let him go, or turned away, or simply nodded. The Meyers responded 3 days later, not with documents, not with notaries, with fire. Jarek's workshop on Copper Street burned down that night. Killian found out at dawn. Bertrand woke him up. The old man's face was ashen. Killian got dressed in a minute and ran across town. When he reached Copper Street, it smelled of wet ash and burnt wood. Only the walls remained of the workshop, black, soot-stained. The roof had caved in. The horn had cracked from the heat. The tools had melted. The neighboring shops were unharmed. The fire had been precise, professional. Only one workshop had burned. Just one. Jarek stood across from it. He looked at the ruins. He didn't move. Killian approached. He stood beside him. He was silent. Jarek was silent too. Then the boy slowly raised his right hand. In it was a blade. That very one. The double-tempered one. He slept with it, every night, under his pillow. The blade had survived because Jarek had taken it to the manor. Everything else had burned. Killian placed a hand on his shoulder. Jarek didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He just stood there. Then he quietly said 2 words, "They'll pay." Killian squeezed his shoulder. He said, "No, they won't pay. Not now. Now they'll rebuild." Jarek turned his head. He looked up at Killian. In his eyes was anger, not a child's resentment. The cold, adult anger of a master whose workshop had been burned down. Killian recognized that anger. He'd felt the same way himself when he'd been on his knees before the execution block. He told Jarek one thing, that the best revenge isn't fire. The best revenge is when you stand before the king at the Council of Seals and your blade cleaves the enemy's ceremonial sword in 2. Jarek was silent. Then he nodded. Once, briefly, like an adult. They returned to the estate. Killian convened a council, the first in the history of House Ashton, where the members were not lords but a kitchen maid, a young blacksmith's apprentice, a laundress, a girl dressed in men's clothing, a servant from another house, and a fiancé who could calculate faster than she could think. Celine laid out the papers, finances, the countess's dowry, income from the workshop that no longer existed, maintenance expenses. The numbers were grim. Without Jarek's workshop, income was falling. The financial cushion was shrinking to 6 weeks. Gia added some information. The fire wasn't being investigated. Captain Olsen of the Night Watch had closed the case that very same day. The cause, careless handling of fire. No suspects. Olsen, who owed the Meyers for a murder they'd covered up. It all added up. Inju said that her grandfather had overheard a conversation on Herb Street. The Meyers were hiring people for another job. No one knew exactly what it was, but they were hiring urgently. Meyer remained silent. She sat in the corner, her hands on her knees. Leah sat next to her brother, upright and quiet, writing everything down in a notebook. Killian listened. He looked at these people. 7 people who, 2 months ago, didn't know each other. A cook, a blacksmith, a herbalist, an informant, a financier, a cartographer, and a laundress. They were sitting at the same table, in a house that was falling apart, across from the great house which had enough money to burn down the entire neighborhood. Killian said they wouldn't be restoring. Everyone looked at him. He said that Jarek would work here, on the estate. There's an old smithy in the courtyard. It hasn't been used for 20 years, but the walls are intact. The forge can be restored. It's cheaper than renting, and safer. The Mears won't dare set foot on the great house's estate, as long as the house is still considered great. Jarek nodded. Celine did the math in her head. She said it would take 8 gold pieces to restore the smithy. They had 12. That would leave 4, enough for a month's living expenses. Killian said there would be more money in a month. Countess Dane is waiting for 3 vials. Mir raised her head. She looked at him. She nodded. She said 2 were ready. The 3rd would be ready in a week. Killian nodded. A plan. A fragile one. Like that clay vial Mir had brought him the first time. But a plan. The council meeting ended. People dispersed. Killian was left alone. He sat and thought about Cassius Myers. Fire, that's his style. A precise strike. No unnecessary noise. No traces. Cassius isn't just an enemy. Cassius also remembered the future, and if, in that future, Jarek had become a great blacksmith, then Cassius knew his name, knew his worth, and decided to destroy his workshop before the boy became a threat. Cassius was playing the same game, from the other side of the board. Killian stood up, walked over to the shelf, took Jarek's blade, turned it over in his hands. The metal was cold, heavy, a strange color, somewhere between silver and steel. In 4 months, this blade must be on the table before the Council of Seals, as proof that House Ashton is worth something. 4 months. He put the blade back, looked out the window. In the courtyard, Jarek was already standing in front of the old smithy. He was looking at the walls, counting, estimating. A 14-year-old boy whose workshop had been burned down, who hadn't cried, who had said they would pay, and who was now standing before the ruins, thinking not of revenge, but of how to set up a new forge. The Myers had burned down Jarek's workshop on Copper Street. Killian convened the first council of all 7 and decided to restore the old smithy on the estate. Meyer was preparing 3 vials for Countess Dane. Killian realized that Cassius also knew the value of future masters and was deliberately destroying them. 3 months after waking up, Killian stood in his father's study. Lord Ansel sat at the table. The goblet stood nearby. But for the first time in a long while, the goblet was empty. His father looked at the papers Killian had laid out before him. A contract with Countess Dane for the supply of perfume compositions, 3 bottles at 40 gold each. 120 gold. More than House Ashton had earned in all of the previous year. Next to it was Celine's ledger. Clean, neat. Every coin in its place. Next to it was Leah's map, the trade routes of Valenrit. Next to that was Ha Donsu's report on the medicinal supplies that the old herbalist had begun delivering to the city garrison. A minor contract, but official, with the garrison commander's seal. Lord Ansel looked at all of this, silently, for a long time. Then he raised his eyes to his son. And Killian saw in those eyes something he had never seen before, neither in his first life nor in this one. Respect. Not love. Love had always been there, deep down, beneath layers of guilt, grief, and shame. But respect, that was new. His father asked how. 1 word. Killian replied that he had found the right people. His father shook his head. He said it wasn't about the people, it was about who had found them. He paused. Then he said what Killian had been waiting 3 months to hear. He said he wanted his son to represent the house on the Council of Seals. Not his father, his son. Killian nodded. He didn't refuse. He didn't play it down. He just nodded. Because he knew it was the right thing to do. That he was ready. That in 4 months, standing before the council wouldn't be a drunken fool in a silk shirt, but a man who knew the value of every item on the table. That evening, Killian sat alone in his study. He reread the notes he still remembered. The names were fading. The dates were blurring. Half the details from the prison conversations had turned into blank spots. But he remembered the big picture, the Council of Seals. The Myers would try to humiliate the Ashtons publicly. Cassius would prepare something. Killian didn't know exactly what. In their past life, the Ashtons had nothing to show, and humiliating them was easy. Now they had masters. That meant Cassius would come up with something else. A knock on the door. Leah. She came in, sat down across from him. She placed a rolled-up map on the table, unrolled it. Killian watched. It wasn't a route map. It was a map of Valenrit, a complete one, with every alley, every shop, every house, with the underground passages that Leah had mapped out based on the rat's movements. By the rat's movements, his 14-year-old sister had mapped out the capital's underground passages based on where the rats ran in the mornings. Killian stared at the map and couldn't speak. Leah sat and waited. Then she said that one of the passages led from the basement of the tavern across the bridge to the basement of the city courthouse. The tavern across the bridge, where the Myers meet with Lord Chiron. an underground passage from their secret meeting place to the courthouse. This meant that the Meyers could pass documents to Judge Dorn without witnesses. Directly. Underground. Killian rolled up the map. He looked at his sister. Leah was looking at him. For the first time in 3 months, there was no coldness in her eyes, no wariness. There was something similar to what he'd seen when she was 5 years old, when she ran toward him across the courtyard shouting, "Big brother!" Before their mother's death, before their father's drinking, before all of it. He told her she was incredible. Leah lowered her eyes, her cheeks flushed slightly. She said it was just a map. Killian shook his head. He said, "No, it's a weapon." Leah looked at him. Then she quietly asked why he was doing all this, why he had changed, why he was saving people he hadn't noticed before, why he got up every morning and fought for a home he hadn't cared about just a year ago. Killian was silent. He couldn't tell the truth. He couldn't say that he'd seen her head shaved at the convent, how she was dying of a fever because no one had paid for a doctor. He couldn't say that he'd knelt before the execution block and thought of her. He said that one day he woke up and realized he'd lost everything that mattered, and he decided to get it back. Leah looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up. She walked around the table, and she hugged him, quickly, tightly, for 3 seconds. Then she let go and left, without looking back. The door closed. Killian sat motionless. 3 seconds. 3 seconds that made it all worth it. Every day, every step, every sleepless night. For 3 seconds of a hug from a sister who hadn't called him brother in 3 years. He rested his head on the table, closed his eyes. He didn't cry. He just lay there and breathed. A minute later, he stood up, straightened up. He went back to work. There were 4 months left until the Council of Seals. He had something to show. He had the masters. He had the maps. He had the numbers. He had a plan. There was only one thing left, to deal with Cassius. Lord Ansel evaluated his son's work for the first time and granted him the right to represent the house at the Council of Seals. Leah created a complete map of Valenrit with underground passages and discovered a connection between the Myers Tavern and the courthouse. For the first time in 3 years, Leah hugged her brother. A month before the Council of Seals, Killian received a note. He found it on his desk that morning. A folded sheet of paper. No seal, no signature. The text was brief. "You remember the chopping block. So do I. But we remember different chopping blocks." Killian read it 3 times, then he sat down in a chair. His hands didn't tremble. He had been waiting for this. Not quite yet, but he had been waiting. Cassius had stopped hiding. Cassius knew, and he wanted Killian to know that he knew. The note was an invitation, not to a fight, to a conversation. 2 people who remember the future and both understand that one of them will lose. Killian hid the note. He didn't show it to anyone, not to Celine, not to Lai, not to Meyer. It was between him and Cassius, between 2 people who had died and come back. Between 2 players on the same board. He continued preparing for the council, every day, methodically, without stopping. Mir had finished 3 vials for the Countess, but these weren't ordinary vials. Each came in a case crafted by Jarek. Each had a scent that changed from morning to evening. The Countess sent a messenger with money and a new order, 10 vials by spring, and a letter of recommendation to Baron Elmont, who supplies the court. 1 letter, 3 lines. The House of Ashton has a master perfumer worthy of royal attention. 3 lines that were worth more than all the Countess's gold. Jarek worked in the restored forge from dawn till dusk. In a month, he forged 12 blades, each one better than the last. The last one was such that Killian didn't recognize the metal. Dark, almost black, light as a feather, so sharp that it cut through a leather belt under its own weight. Jarek said he'd found a new temperature. Triple tempering, 3 stages instead of 2. Killian looked at the blade and thought that in a past life, this boy had only discovered triple tempering after 5 years. Here, right now, at 14, because he had a forge and 3 meals a day. And a room with a bed. And a man who had never once hit him for making a mistake. Celine prepared a financial report for the council. The figures were modest, but honest. In 3 months, House Ashton had cut expenses by 40%, tripled its revenue, paid off its fictitious debt. It secured a contract with Countess Dane and a garrison contract through Ha Dong-soo. For a great house, this was not much. For a house that had been teetering on the brink of collapse just 3 months ago, it was a miracle. Ha Dong-soo prepared a report on medicinal preparations. His granddaughter, Eun-ju, helped him. She compiled a catalog of 112 herbs, with illustrations, with descriptions, with dosages. Killian hadn't asked her to do this. She did it on her own, because she wanted her grandfather to appear before the council as a master, not as an old man with a stall on the outskirts. Leah drew a map of the Ashton house's trade routes, current tem and potential, with distance calculations, with notes on garrisons and inns, indicating seasonal roads. The map was of such high quality that a cartographer from the capital's guild would have paid gold for it. Gia brought the final batch of information. The Meyers are preparing their fighter for the council, the Duke's best swordsman, for an exhibition duel, a tradition of the Council of Seals. Each house fields a fighter armed with a weapon forged by its own blacksmith. If the sword breaks, it means the blacksmith is poor. It means the house has nothing to be proud of. The Myerses had counted on the Ashtons having neither a fighter nor a blacksmith, that the house would refuse the duel, that it would be a public humiliation. Killian smiled. For the first time in a week, they didn't have a fighter. That was true. Killian didn't know how to wield a sword. His father was too old. Jarek was a child. But they had a blade, that very one, triple-tempered, black metal, light as a feather. He needed a fighter, just one. Anyone. Someone who could step into the arena and hold out long enough for the blades to clash. Because when Jarek's blade met the ducal fighter's ceremonial sword, what had happened in his past life 8 years ago would happen again. The ceremonial sword would break. Killian knew where to find a fighter. Yinju. She didn't just need clay and brew potions. She wore men's clothing. She spoke her mind, she moved quickly, and she had calluses on her palms, not from a mortar, but from a sword hilt. Killian asked her point-blank if she knew how to fence. Yinjo froze. Then she replied that her grandfather had been teaching her since she was 12, the southern style, a short blade, quick strikes. Killian asked if she was ready to step into the council ring as a fighter for House Ashton. Yinju was silent for half a minute. Then she said that women do not participate in exhibition matches. Killian replied that the council's rules didn't say a fighter had to be a man. They only said that a fighter had to represent the house. Yinju looked at him, then at her hands, then at him again, and she smiled. For the first time in Killian's memory, broadly, predatorily, the kind of smile a person has when they've just been offered the chance to do what they've dreamed of their whole life. She said she needed a blade. Killian handed her Jarek's work. Yinjo took it. She turned it over in her hands, weighed it, made 2 quick swings in the air, looked at the blade, and she said one word. It'll do. There were 4 weeks left until the council. Yinjo trained every day. In the courtyard, early in the morning, while everyone was asleep, except for Leah, Leah watched from the window, and she drew. Killian found a drawing on her desk. Yinju with a blade, in motion, swift, precise, beautiful. Leah didn't draw maps. Leah drew people, yet another talent no one had ever asked about. A week before the council, a second message arrived from Cassius. Not a note, a flower, a white lily, on Killian's desk. No note, no explanation. A white lily in Valenrit meant only one thing, a funeral. Cassius was warning her, or threatening her. Or both. Killian placed the lily in water on the windowsill. Let it stand there. Let Cassius see that his message has been received. And that Killian isn't afraid. Because there was no time to be afraid. The night before the Council of Seals, Killian was alone in his office. Everything was laid out on the table. A bottle of Mireille perfume, Jarek's blade, Leah's map, Celine's ledger, Ha Dansu's herb catalog. He sat and looked at these objects. 5 items, 5 people, 5 pieces of evidence that House Ashton is worth something. The door creaked. His father, Lord Ansel, entered, for the first time on his own. Not because he'd been summoned. He sat down silently across from him. He was silent for a long time. Then he said hoarsely that he didn't know what had happened to him, but that he could see. He could see everything. Killian didn't answer. He stood up. He picked up the teapot. He poured his father some tea. With his own hands, for the first time in his life, he set the cup in front of his father. His father stared at the cup. Then his shoulders began to shake, silently, like old men who have forgotten how to cry out loud. Killian thought, "Father. For a year I watched as they cut off your head. I'll take care of everything." But he said only one thing out loud. "Drink it while it's hot." The two of them sat there. They drank tea. They were silent. The first snow was falling outside the window. Tomorrow was the Council of Seals. Tomorrow everything would be decided. The Council of Seals was held in the throne room of Valenrit. Stone columns, tall windows, cold, white light streamed in from above. 5 tables for the 5 great houses. At each table, a representative, with evidence, with masters, with fighters. Killian entered last, not out of modesty, out of calculation. The last to enter is remembered best. His entourage followed him, not lavish, not gilded, strange. Leah in a simple dress, old man Ha Dong-su in a clean robe, Yinju in men's clothing with a dagger at her belt, Celine with a folder of papers, and behind them, the invisible yet palpable shadow of Meyer, who had remained at the estate because she refused to go out among the people. The hall buzzed. The Ashtons. The last time they had appeared before the council, they had been represented by a drunken Lord Ansel with trembling hands. Now his son had come, sober, wearing his father's old doublet, standing with his back straight, and accompanied by an entourage of people whom no one in the hall knew. Cassius Myers stood at his house's table. He was smiling. Next to him stood a bull-like swordsman in ceremonial armor. Behind him stood Duke Valtor, heavy, gloomy, with the eyes of a bird of prey. The proceedings began. Each house presented its evidence. House Kyren showed a new fabric, beautiful but not outstanding. House Dane presented a collection of paintings. House Raven, a military contract with the southern border. House Myers. Killian watched. Cassius stepped forward. He spoke. His voice was steady, warm, convincing. He presented 3 contracts: trade with the Southern Principality, a steel supply contract for the Royal Fleet, and a new mine in the Western lands. Each contract was sealed with official seals. Every figure had been verified. The hall hummed with approval. The Myers were strong, flawless, invincible. Then Cassius turned toward the Ashton table and smiled. That very smile. He said he looked forward to seeing what House Ashton would present. The hall fell silent. Everyone looked at Killian. They waited, some with curiosity, some with pity, many with anticipation of disgrace. Killian stood up. He walked to the central table, silently, slowly. He took 5 items out of his bag, one by one. He placed them on the table. A bottle of Mireille perfume in Jarek's case, Jarek's triple-tempered blade, Leia's map of trade routes, Celine's expense ledger, Hadansu's herb catalog. 5 items, 5 masters. The hall fell silent. Killian spoke, quietly, without fanfare, without grand words. He said that the House of Ashton represented 5 masters: a perfumer, a blacksmith, a cartographer, a financier, a healer. Each of them is under 25 years old. Each of them started from scratch. Each of them created what lies on this table, with their own hands, in 3 months. He fell silent. Then he said one sentence. If the House of Ashton were to disappear, this will disappear too. Ask yourselves if it's worth it. Silence. Absolute silence. Then one of the Crown's advisors stood up. He walked over to the table. He picked up Jarek's blade. He turned it over in his hands. He ran his finger along the edge. He looked at Killian. He asked who the blacksmith was. Killian replied that he was a 14-year-old boy. The advisor turned pale. He put the blade back down. He sat down. Another advisor took a vial. He opened it. He inhaled. He closed his eyes. Then he passed it to the person next to him. A third was studying a map of Leah. A fourth was leafing through a herb catalog. The hall came alive. Whispers, surprise, disbelief, and something else, interest. Cassius stood by his table. He was no longer smiling. His face was calm, but his eyes were calculating, quickly, intently. He hadn't expected this. He'd expected an empty table, a drunken air, disgrace. Not 5 items that had forced the Crown's advisors to rise from their seats. Then the exhibition duel began. The Myers put forward their swordsman, a massive man in ceremonial armor wielding a 2-handed sword. The crowd roared in approval. Then Inju rose from the Ashton table. The hall fell silent. A woman, in men's clothing, with a short blade, against a 2-meter-tall fighter in armor. Cassius turned to the senior advisor. He was about to object, that she was a woman, that it was unheard of, that it was an insult to tradition. The advisor raised his hand. He said that the council's rules did not specify a fighter's gender, only their affiliation with a house. Cassius clamped his mouth shut. His jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles on his cheekbones bulged. Yinju stepped onto the arena, light on her feet, quick. Jarek's blade in her right hand. Black metal, slender. The Mir's swordsman looked down at her. He smirked. He raised his two-handed sword. They began. The swordsman struck first. Hard. Powerful. A blow that was meant to end the fight in a second. Yinju stepped aside. She didn't block. She moved out of the way. Southern style. Don't stand in the path of force. Move away. Come back. Strike. The swordsman struck again. And again. And again. Yinju moved like water. She flowed. She moved away. She returned. She didn't attack. She waited. The hall fell silent. Even those who had been laughing fell silent, because the swordsman was missing. Time and again. And the girl in men's clothing wasn't even out of breath. On the seventh strike, it happened. The swordsman delivered a slashing blow from top to bottom. Yinju parried with her blade. Not straight on. At an angle. Jarek's black blade met the mirror's ceremonial sword. A sound. Short. Ringing. Like a bell. The ceremonial sword cracked. From the middle of the blade to the hilt. The two halves fell onto the stone floor. The hall fell silent. The swordsman stood with a shard in his hands. He looked down. He didn't understand. Yinju took a step back. She lowered her blade. There wasn't a single scratch on the black blade. The silence lasted 5 seconds. Then the hall erupted. Not with applause. With whispers. Furious, rapid whispers. Everyone was talking at once. Who is this blacksmith? What kind of metal is this? How is this possible? A 14-year-old boy. Triple tempering. House Ashton. Killian stood at his table. He looked at Cassius across the hall. Cassius looked at him. Their eyes met. Killian didn't smile. Neither did Cassius. Two men who remembered the future. Two men who knew that this moment had changed everything. The senior advisor to the crown rose. The hall fell silent. He announced that the Council of Seals recognizes House Ashton as the rising house. Based on the results presented by the masters and the exhibition duel, the house receives a commission from the crown for the supply of blades, for the supply of perfumery compositions, and for cartographic work. The hall buzzed. Duke Valtor Myers sat motionless. His face was stony. Next to him stood Cassius. He too was motionless. His face too was stony, but something burned in his eyes. Not anger, not resentment, acknowledgement. Reluctant, through gritted teeth, but acknowledgement nonetheless. Killian gathered his 5 items from the table. He turned. He walked toward the exit. Behind him were Leah, Yinzhou, Celine, Ha Dong-su. At the door, he turned around. Just once. Cassius was standing by the column, alone, watching him leave. Their eyes met for a second. Cassius nodded almost imperceptibly. Killian nodded back and walked out. At the Council of Seals, Killian presented the works of all 5 masters. In an exhibition duel, Yinju broke the Myers ceremonial sword with Jarek's blade. The House of Ashton was granted rising status and a commission from the crown. Cassius silently acknowledged Killian's victory in this round. A winter night. Snow was falling on the garden of the Ashton estate, quietly, slowly, in large flakes. Killian stood on the balcony, alone. The council had ended 6 hours ago. Everyone in the house was asleep. Leah was in her room. The door was ajar. Maps and drawings lay on the table. A new drawing hung on the wall. Yinju with a blade in her hand. Meyer was in her workshop, surrounded by vials and dried herbs. She now had a door she could close, and she closed it every night, not out of fear, but for peace of mind. Jarek was in the smithy. He'd fallen asleep by the forge, just as he did every other night. His sword lay nearby, always nearby. Celine was in the library, asleep over the ledger, a quill in her hand, an unfinished number on the page. Ha Dong-su had gone to the shop, but he'd be back tomorrow, just as he returned every week. Unju was with him. For the first time in 20 years, the old man wasn't alone. Jia had gone to her room. Tomorrow is Thursday. She'll come. With news, with stories, with a loud voice and sparkling eyes. Irma had put the children to bed. The oldest boy had started helping out in the kitchen. The middle one had become friends with Jeremy. The youngest girl spent all day following Mide around and sniffing everything Mide let her sniff. Father was sleeping in his study. A cup on the table. Empty. A teacup beside it. Half empty. He drank tea every evening, ever since his son had poured him that first cup. Rowena had left, quietly, without a scene, a week after the council. Her brother, Lord David Thorne, had recalled her. The reason was unknown. Killian had his suspicions. The Mides had retreated, temporarily. After the council, their position had weakened. The fictitious debt had been cancelled. Notary F. Rid Morel was arrested by the guild. Captain Olson was quietly transferred to another city after the map of Leah showing the underground passage ended up on the garrison commander's desk. Judge Dorn is still in place, but without Olson and without Freed, his reach has been curtailed. The Meyers are not broken, but they have been slowed down. Duke Valtor has stopped smiling at receptions. Cassius has stopped appearing in society. Silence, the kind that comes before the storm. Killian stood on the balcony and looked at the snow. He thought of Cassius, of the note. You remember the chopping block. So do I, but we remember different chopping blocks. Different chopping blocks. That means Cassius was dying too, not just once. 11 times. He said 11 times. 11 deaths, 11 returns, 11 attempts. And every time he ended up on one side, against someone who also remembered. Two who remember the future play a single game, and the world follows the path of the one who wins. An ancient ritual forgotten by all except a secret order. Two, always enemies. In a past life, Cassius won. The Ashtons perished. The Meyers rose to power. But did Cassius really win, or did he simply not lose? A figure emerged from the darkness of the garden, unescorted, unarmed, wearing a simple cloak. Cassius. He approached the balcony. He stopped below, looked up. Snow fell on his hair, on his shoulders. He didn't brush it off. Killian looked down at him from above. He was silent. Cassius spoke first, quietly, without a smile, without calculation. Just the voice of a man who was tired. He asked if Killian remembered what it felt like when an axe sank into the neck. Killian replied that he remembered. Once. Cassius nodded. He said he'd had 11. 11 times he'd felt the cold of the blade. 11 times he'd closed his eyes and thought it was the end. 11 times he'd woken up again. And every time there was someone standing on the other side. Someone who also remembered. Someone who was also playing the game. Someone who was also trying to build something. And every time, one of them won and the other died. Killian listened. Snow fell between them. Cassius continued. He said that the first time, he was like Killian. He saved people. He helped the masters. He built. He believed. And he lost. To the one who was tougher, cuter, more ruthless. The second time, he became tougher. And he lost again, to the one who was kinder, because the kind one gathered more people around him. By the 5th time, he stopped understanding what was right. By the 8th, he stopped trying. By the 11th, he simply began to win, at any cost, because victory had become the only thing that made sense. He fell silent. Then he looked at the windows of the estate, warm, yellow. Behind them slept the people Killian had gathered. Cassius said quietly that he was tired, that he was truly tired. But he couldn't stop, because if he stopped, it would mean that all 11 deaths had been in vain. Killian looked at him, at the young man in the snow, 24 years old, the eyes of an old man. He realized something. Cassius wasn't an enemy. Cassius was himself. After 11 attempts, after 11 deaths, after 11 lives in which the world had broken him over and over again until nothing remained but the desire to win. Killian stepped down from the balcony. He went out into the courtyard. He approached Cassius. They stood side by side, 2 young men in the snow. They were silent. Then Killian spoke, quietly. He said he wouldn't fight him. Cassius turned his head. For the first time, there was something other than calculation in his eyes. Surprise. Killian continued. He said that the ritual required one to win, for one to lose. For the world to follow the victor's path. But what if they both went the same way? What if, instead of a game where one wins and the other dies, they played a game where both live? Cassius was silent. For a long time. Snow settled on his shoulders. Then he said it was impossible, that the ritual wouldn't allow it, that 2 who remember are always enemies. Always. Killian replied that the ritual was written by people, and people make mistakes, even those who lived 1,000 years ago. Cassius looked at him. Killian saw something breaking behind his eyes, slowly, like ice on a river in spring, not all at once, a crack, just one. Cassius asked why he needed this. Why would he need an enemy he had spared? Killian answered with a single word: the eighth. Cassius didn't understand. Killian explained: save at least 7. He has 7. But the condition says at least. The eighth won't be superfluous. Cassius stood motionless. Then something happened to his face. It flinched, like glass struck by a stone. It didn't shatter, but it cracked. He turned away, quickly, so that Killian wouldn't see. But Killian saw. Because Cassius Myers, 24 years old, who had died 11 times, was crying. Silently. The way people cry who have forgotten how to do it. They stood in the snow. For a long time. Then Cassius turned around. His face was wet. His eyes were red. His voice was hoarse. He said he couldn't promise anything, that he didn't know if he could, that 11 lives were too many to just up and give up. Killian nodded. He said he wasn't in a hurry. Cassius looked at the warm windows of the manor, then at Killian, then at the snow beneath his feet. He said that if Killian deceived him, if this was a trap, he wouldn't forgive him. Killian replied that he knew. Cassius turned away. He walked toward the gate. Halfway there, he stopped. He turned around. He said that his niece, Lorelei, wears this perfume every day. She never takes it off. She even sleeps with the bottle under her pillow. That she hadn't slept for 3 nights after receiving it. And that, for the first time in 21 years, her uncle doesn't know what his niece is thinking. And that frightened him more than the blade that had broken the ceremonial sword. Cassius walked off into the snow, without looking back. Killian stood alone. Behind him, the warm windows, a sister who was hugging him again, a girl with an absolute sense of smell, a boy who forged the future out of fire, a fiancé who could calculate faster than all the Myers accountants combined, the girl in men's clothing who broke a stranger's sword before the eyes of the entire council, the informant who knew the city better than the guards, the old herbalist who had waited 20 years for someone to remember him, the laundress who told the truth because she was offered a home, and his father, who drank tea every evening, because his son had poured him a cup once. Snow was falling, quietly, slowly. Down in the courtyard, an old red dog lifted his muzzle. He saw Killian, wagged his tail. Killian went down, crouched down beside him, stroked the dog's head. The dog nudged his wet nose against Killian's palm. Killian crouched in the snow and stroked the dog he'd chased away in a past life for dirty boots. And he smiled. Not for anyone, just because. For himself. For the first time in 2 lifetimes. He didn't save the world. He saved Meyer, and Jarek, and Leah, and Old Man Hay, and Seelan, and Gia, and Yinju, and Irma, one by one. The world is what came of it in the end. And the world turned out to be warm. Snow was falling on Valenrit, on the tiled roofs, on Copper Street, on Grass Street, on Silk Alley, on the market where Gia would haggle over ribbons tomorrow, on the tavern across the bridge, which was now empty, on the Notaries Guild building, where an arrested swindler awaited trial, on Countess Dane's mansion, where a bottle in a case with a rose sat on the dressing table, on the Myers estate, where Lorelei clutched a small glass vial to her chest and thought about the words spoken to her by a strange young man with a quiet voice and old eyes, to the Ashton estate, where coals were smoldering out in the forge and a black blade lay on the anvil, where, in the north wing behind a closed door, rows of vials stood, where, on a 14-year-old girl's table, lay a map worth more than a fortress, where, in the library, a woman slept with a quill in her hand, a woman who could count better than anyone, where an old butler stood by the window, watching a young master sitting in the snow and petting a dog. And for the first time in 20 years of service, Bertrand didn't understand what was happening. But he knew it was right. Killian stood up. He brushed the snow off his knees. He looked up at the sky, then at the house, then at his hands. The same hands. Slender. Hands that had never held anything heavier than a glass. But now, in those hands, there were people. And that was heavier than any sword. He entered the house. He closed the door. Ahead lay the second year. War with the Mears. The mystery of the Order of the Two Rememberers. a commission from the crown, workshops, schools, guilds. And somewhere ahead, the day when Leah would call him her brother. For real. Out loud. In front of everyone. But that would come later. Now he climbed the stairs. He walked past Leah's door, left ajar just a hand's width, and passed the door to Mireille's workshop, locked with a lock that Jarek had made. He entered his room. He sat down on the bed. On the nightstand stood a clay flask, the first one, crooked, made of kitchen clay, smelling of roses and lemon and morning. Killian picked it up, turned it over in his hands, put it back. He lay down. He closed his eyes. That strange, old, weary force was no longer staring at the back of his head. It was gone. Or asleep. Or perhaps it had simply smiled and turned away. He fell asleep. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, without fear. Snow was falling outside the window. Quiet. Quiet. Quiet.